Barber paradox. Imagine a small town where the barber is a very specific man. He shaves only those men who do not shave themselves. The question arises, who shaves the barber? At first, the answer seems simple. If the barber shaves himself, then by the rule he cannot. But if he does not shave himself, then by the rule he must. This creates an immediate logical contradiction. The barber both must and must not shave himself. The barber paradox, a famous riddle from the field of set theory and logic, exposes the limits of self-referential reasoning. It raises important questions about sets, categories, and the rules that govern them. The paradox makes us reconsider how we define relationships, categories, and even the fundamental assumptions of mathematics and logic. In a world governed by clear rules, how can they break down so simply? Let's dive into this paradox and explore how self-representary can lead to contradictions and confusion in logical systems. The barber paradox is a classic self-representary paradox that was introduced by the famous philosopher and logician Bertrand Russell in the early 20th century. It is a simplified version of Russell's paradox, which is a well-known contradiction that arises in set theory, the branch of mathematics that studies sets or collections of objects. Russell's paradox shows that set theory, as originally formulated, leads to a contradiction when trying to define a set of all sets that do not contain themselves. The barber paradox is essentially a thought experiment designed to illustrate this paradox in a more accessible way. In the barber paradox, the barber is a person who shaves only those men who do not shave themselves. The logical problem arises when we try to apply this rule to the barber himself. If he shaves himself, he violates the rule that only men who do not shave themselves can be shaved by him. But if he does not shave himself, then he must be shaved by the barber, as per the rule. This creates a contradiction, as the barber cannot consistently fit into the category of men who both shave and do not shave themselves. Russell introduced this paradox as a way to show the limitations of set theory and to challenge the assumptions about how categories are defined in mathematics. The paradox helped Russell develop his theory of types, which was an attempt to resolve the contradictions that arise from self-referential definitions in formal systems. The barber paradox is deceptively simple in its setup. A barber shaves only those men who do not shave themselves. But when we try to apply this rule to the barber himself, we quickly find ourselves caught in a contradiction. The paradox is a powerful illustration of how self-referential rules, when applied too rigidly, can lead to logical inconsistencies. To understand the paradox fully, let's break it down step by step. The barber is defined by a simple rule: he shaves all men who do not shave themselves. The question that arises is, who shaves the barber? At first, this seems like a straightforward question. The answer seems to be either the barber shaves himself or someone else shaves him. However, the rule creates an immediate contradiction when we apply it to the barber himself. If the barber shaves himself, then he must fall under the category of men who do shave themselves. But by the barber's rule, he can only shave men who do not shave themselves. This creates a problem. The barber cannot shave himself if he is the one who is supposed to be shaved by the barber. On the other hand, if the barber does not shave himself, then according to the rule, he must be shaved by the barber, because the barber only shaves men who do not shave themselves. But this leads to another contradiction. If the barber is shaved by himself, then by the rule he must not shave himself, because he only shaves men who do not shave themselves. In essence, the barber's rule creates a paradoxical situation in which the barber both must and must not shave himself. The paradox arises from the self-referential nature of the rule. The rule depends on whether the barber shaves himself, but the act of trying to determine this creates a contradiction. The barber paradox is a simplified version of Russell's paradox, which arises in the field of set theory, a branch of mathematics that deals with collections of objects. In set theory, a set is simply a collection of objects that satisfy a specific rule. For example, the set of all apples is the collection of all objects that are apples. But Russell showed that certain sets, when defined in a self-referential way, lead to contradictions. Russell's paradox involves the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. If such a set exists, we run into a contradiction. If the set contains itself, then by definition it must not contain itself. But if the set does not contain itself, then by definition it must contain itself. This paradox exposes the inconsistencies in the basic assumptions of set theory and challenges the idea that sets can be freely defined by any rule. The barber paradox is essentially a more intuitive version of this problem. The barber, who shaves only those who do not shave themselves, creates a situation similar to Russell's paradox. The barber's rule leads to a contradictory situation when we try to apply it to the barber himself. This paradox highlights how self-referential rules can create contradictions, making it impossible to consistently define certain categories. At the heart of the barber paradox is the concept of self-referential, the idea that a rule refers to itself. In the case of the barber, the rule that governs who is shaved by the barber also applies to the barber himself. The paradox shows how self-referential definitions can lead to contradiction. When a rule refers to the category it is part of, it becomes impossible to consistently apply that rule, because the rule creates a situation where the object of the rule, the barber, both belongs and does not belong to the category. Self-referential paradoxes are a common feature in philosophy and logic, and they often expose the limitations of formal systems. The liar paradox, where a sentence refers to itself as being false, this sentence is false, is another classic example of self-referenceship gone awry. These paradoxes force us to question the assumptions behind our logical systems and ask whether our rules of inference can be trusted when they involve self-referenceship. In mathematics, set theory is one of the most important fields affected by self-referential paradoxes. Russell's paradox showed that the concept of a set of all sets that do not contain themselves leads to a contradiction, and this was a key turning point in the development of modern logic. To avoid such contradictions, Russell proposed a solution called type theory, which restricted the kinds of sets that could be defined. The idea is that sets cannot contain themselves, and this restriction resolves the paradox. The barber paradox highlights how the act of defining a rule in terms of itself can lead to contradictions. By applying the barber's rule to himself, we fall into a loop of contradictions, unable to determine whether the barber shaves himself or not. This is a key insight into how self-referential statements can cause problems in logical reasoning. The barber paradox forces us to reconsider the nature of categories and definitions. In formal systems, definitions are meant to provide clear distinctions between objects and concepts. But self-referential definitions blur these distinctions and lead to contradictions. The paradox invites us to think about how we create and understand categories, and whether we can ever truly define something without eventually falling into self-reference. This paradox also raises questions about identity and belonging. The barber's rule creates a situation where the barber both belongs and does not belong to the category of men who are shaved by the barber. This paradox forces us to question the nature of self-identity and how we define ourselves within a system. Can we ever truly belong to a category? Or are we always at risk of falling into contradictions when we try to define ourselves? The barber paradox is also a reminder that rules and categories are not always as objective as they seem. Even simple rules about who can be shaved by the barber lead to contradictions when we try to apply them universally. This suggests that our logical systems may not always be as stable or reliable as we assume, especially when they involve self-referential or circular reasoning. The barber paradox can be resolved by restricting the kinds of definitions we allow in formal systems. Type theory, introduced by Bertrand Russell, resolves self-referential paradoxes by ensuring that sets or categories cannot contain themselves. In type theory, a set of all sets that do not contain themselves is not allowed, because such a set would lead to a contradiction. Similarly, the barber in the paradox cannot both be a member of the group of men who shave themselves and the group of men who do not shave themselves. By creating a system that distinguishes between different types of categories, type theory avoids the paradox. Another potential resolution to the paradox is to rethink the application of the barber's rule. Instead of defining the barber's role in a self-referential way, we might try to define the rule more clearly, ensuring that it applies only to those who are not the barber. This could eliminate the contradiction and allow us to consistently apply the rule. Lottery paradox. Imagine you are standing in line to buy a lottery ticket. You know the odds of winning are nearly impossible, millions to one. As you walk out of the store, you feel confident that, just like everyone else, you're unlikely to win. But now consider the following. What if you were told that exactly one person will win the lottery, and they are one of the people who just bought a ticket? This is the lottery paradox. You know that one person must win, but you also know that each individual ticket holder is extremely unlikely to win. How can you simultaneously believe that with certainty you won't win, while also knowing that someone will win, including yourself? The paradox challenges our understanding of probability, belief, and certainty. If the odds of winning are so low, how can we justify believing we won't win, and yet accept that someone will inevitably win? Let's dive into this paradox and explore how it forces us to confront the limitations of our beliefs and the nature of rational decision-making. The lottery paradox has its roots in epistemic logic, the study of knowledge, belief, and reasoning. It was first explored in the early 20th century by philosophers and logicians such as Richard Jeffrey and David Lewis, who were concerned with how people form beliefs in the face of uncertainty. The paradox itself comes from the idea that, while you know the odds of winning the lottery are extremely low for each individual ticket holder, you also know that exactly one person must win. The paradox was developed as part of broader philosophical inquiries into probability theory and belief revision. How we adjust our beliefs based on new information. The lottery paradox is significant because it shows how we often rely on probabilistic reasoning to form beliefs. But this reasoning can lead to contradictions when it comes to individual belief and group certainty. For instance, each ticket holder has a belief that they won't win, yet the probability of one person winning is certain. The paradox is closely related to the problem of induction, where we form conclusions based on empirical observations, but those conclusions may not always hold true in every case. Just because something is probable does not mean it is inevitable for any given individual. The lottery paradox forces us to reconsider how we use probability and certainty in our decision-making and belief systems, as it reveals that even rational belief in low probability events can lead to contradictions. The lottery paradox is a fascinating and perplexing challenge to our understanding of probability, belief, and certainty. It highlights how we form beliefs about the world based on uncertainty and the law of large numbers, but how these beliefs can sometimes lead to contradictions or challenges when examined more deeply. To understand the paradox fully, we must explore the tension between individual belief and collective certainty. At first, the lottery paradox seems to be a simple problem of probabilities. Imagine that you buy a lottery ticket, and you know that there are 1 million tickets in the lottery, and that only one ticket will win. The odds of winning are therefore 1 in a million, so you are highly unlikely to win. In fact, if you think about it logically, you might even believe that, given the extremely low odds, it's almost certain that you won't win. This belief is rational. If you calculate the probability of winning, it is so low that you can reasonably assume you won't be the one to win. However, now consider the broader picture. The lottery will be won by someone, and exactly one person will hold the winning ticket. There is no doubt that someone will win, it's a certainty. But if you believe, as you do, that the odds of your individual ticket winning are so low, how can you reconcile the fact that someone must win with your belief that you are unlikely to be that person? In other words, how can you hold the belief that you won't win while also knowing that one ticket holder will inevitably win? This creates a contradiction. You are certain that someone will win, but you believe, based on the odds, that you are not the person who will win. How can both of these beliefs be true simultaneously? The paradox arises from the tension between probabilistic reasoning and logical certainty. On one hand, probabilistic reasoning suggests that the chance of winning the lottery is so low that you are almost certain not to win. This is a perfectly rational belief based on the statistical odds. However, on the other hand, the certainty of the lottery's outcome, that someone will win, creates a situation where, although you are rationally convinced that you are unlikely to win, you are logically certain that someone in the group of ticket holders must win. In order to fully grasp the paradox, consider the following reasoning. Premise 1. You buy a ticket and the odds of winning are extremely low. Premise 2. Given the odds, you believe that you are highly unlikely to win. Premise 3. You also know that one person must win. This leads to a logical conflict. The paradox occurs because we are attempting to apply probability to a collective certainty. We know that one winner will emerge, but each individual ticket holder, by the rules of probability, should believe that they are highly unlikely to be that person, yet they are also part of the collective pool of winners, and one of them must be chosen. Thus, each individual ticket holder must reconcile their probabilistic belief that they won't win with the certainty that one of them will win, and this creates a paradox. The lottery paradox also touches on belief revision. the process by which we adjust our beliefs based on new information. In the context of the lottery, you revise your belief about the likelihood of winning when you understand the odds, but you are also aware that someone will win. So how can you simultaneously hold two beliefs? One that you will not win, based on the low probability, and one that you must be the winner, in some abstract sense, because the lottery will be won. This paradox questions the rationality of belief. In traditional epistemic logic, we typically believe that if an event is highly unlikely, we should adjust our belief to reflect that. But the lottery paradox challenges this by showing that, even with a strong belief in probability, we are forced to acknowledge the inevitability of the lottery's outcome. So, how do we adjust our beliefs when there is both uncertainty about an individual outcome and certainty about the collective outcome? The lottery paradox raises important questions about the interpretation of probability and how we reason about uncertain events. Frequentist probability theory, which is based on the idea that probabilities reflect long-term frequencies of events, suggests that while the chance of an individual winning is very low, the certainty of one person winning is inevitable. This creates a probabilistic tension. We know that the event will happen, but we cannot pinpoint who will experience it. The paradox challenges our understanding of probabilistic reasoning in relation to individual events. We assume that if something is highly unlikely, it will not happen to us. But in the case of the lottery, the individual probability of winning is low, yet the aggregate probability ensures that someone must win. This contradiction exposes the limits of probabilistic reasoning when it comes to events with fixed outcomes, such as the lottery. The lottery paradox highlights the tension between logical certainty and probabilistic belief. It shows how the knowledge of an inevitable outcome can conflict with the individual's belief about their personal chance of winning. In real-world decision-making, we often rely on probabilistic reasoning to guide our choices, but the paradox suggests that, in certain cases, this reasoning can lead to contradictory beliefs. For example, in game theory and decision theory, we often have to consider the probability of certain outcomes, but the lottery paradox reminds us that, even when the odds are against us, we cannot ignore the certainty of the outcome. This has profound implications for how we make decisions about uncertain events, especially when our individual beliefs conflict with the larger structure of outcomes. It suggests that rational decision-making may sometimes involve reconciling conflicting beliefs about probability and certainty. One possible resolution to the lottery paradox is to recognize that both beliefs, the rational belief that you won't win and the logical certainty that someone will win, can coexist, even if they seem contradictory. The paradox does not necessarily require us to abandon probabilistic reasoning, but rather to accept that our beliefs about individual outcomes can coexist with the broader certainty of a collective event. This duality reflects the complexity of belief systems and how they can accommodate uncertainty and certainty simultaneously. Another way to resolve the paradox is through the concept of belief revision. Rather than treating the paradox as a contradiction, we could view it as an invitation to revise our beliefs in response to new information. As the lottery progresses and the chance of winning becomes more apparent, we adjust our beliefs to reflect the evolving situation, which may help us reconcile the tension between individual probabilities and collective certainty. Raven paradox. Imagine you are walking down the street and you see a raven. Based on the hypothesis, all ravens are black, this raven confirms the theory that all ravens are indeed black. But now, consider this. You also see a white shoe, and you think, this white shoe also confirms that all ravens are black. How can a white shoe, something unrelated to ravens, confirm a theory about their colour? The raven paradox forces us to rethink what counts as evidence for or against a theory. While the sighting of a black raven clearly supports the idea that all ravens are black, the sighting of a white shoe seems counterintuitive as evidence in support of the same theory. The paradox challenges our understanding of confirmation and evidence in scientific reasoning and everyday reasoning. If unrelated observations can confirm a theory, how do we know what counts as valid evidence? Let's dive into this paradox and explore the surprising ways in which we validate knowledge and why our intuitions about evidence may sometimes be misleading. The Raven paradox, also known as Hempel's paradox, was introduced by the German philosopher Carl Gustav Hempel in the 1940s as a thought experiment in the philosophy of science. It explores the idea of confirmation theory, which deals with how evidence is used to support or disprove scientific hypotheses. Specifically, The paradox challenges the way in which we think about what constitutes evidence for a hypothesis. The paradox arises from the principle of confirmation, which states that evidence can support a hypothesis in two ways, either by confirming the hypothesis directly or by disconfirming its negation. In the case of the hypothesis all ravens are black, any observation of a black raven seems to directly confirm the theory. However, according to Hempel, an observation of a non-black object, such as a white shoe, also logically confirms the theory because it is an observation of a non-black object that is not a raven. This creates a paradox because, while we would intuitively regard seeing a white shoe as irrelevant to the theory, confirmation theory suggests it still counts as evidence supporting the hypothesis. The paradox has been the subject of much debate in the philosophy of science and logic, with scholars questioning how we should treat evidence in scientific reasoning. Hempel's paradox demonstrates the complexities involved in scientific inference and has important implications for how we understand the role of evidence in forming beliefs about the world. The raven paradox is a perplexing issue in confirmation theory that challenges our intuitive understanding of evidence and how it contributes to confirming or refuting a hypothesis. While it might seem like common sense that only direct observations of relevant objects, such as black ravens, count as evidence for the theory all ravens are black, the paradox suggests that even observations of irrelevant objects, such as white shoes, can be considered evidence in support of the hypothesis. To understand this paradox, we need to break down the underlying reasoning and explore the implications for scientific inference and epistemology. The raven paradox begins with a simple hypothesis. All ravens are black. This is a universal generalization, which means it applies to every raven in existence. The hypothesis suggests that if we were to examine any raven, it would be black. Now, consider the process of testing this hypothesis. In order to confirm the hypothesis, we would look for black ravens. Each time we observe a black raven, this provides positive confirmation for the hypothesis. This is straightforward and in line with our everyday reasoning. Seeing a black raven makes the hypothesis more likely to be true. But now, according to Hempel's logic, the theory all ravens are black can also be confirmed by the absence of counterexamples. This means that any observation of a non-black object that is not a raven can also be considered evidence confirming the hypothesis. For example, if you observe a white shoe, you are not observing a raven, but you are observing something that is not a raven and is not counter to the hypothesis. Since the theory is about all ravens being black, the fact that a non-raven object is not black does not disprove the theory, and it counts as a form of confirmation. The paradox arises because this seems counterintuitive. While the sighting of a black raven makes sense as confirming evidence, the sighting of an unrelated object, like a white shoe, feels irrelevant to the hypothesis. Yet, in the logic of confirmation theory, it still counts as evidence supporting the theory, simply because it is not a counterexample to the hypothesis. The paradox forces us to confront a deeper question about how we think of confirmation in everyday life. We naturally associate confirmation with direct and relevant evidence. Seeing a black raven directly supports the hypothesis that all ravens are black. But when we extend the logic of confirmation theory to include unrelated observations, such as a white shoe, the confirmation process seems to break down. It suggests that any observation of an object that is not a counterexample to the theory can serve as a form of confirmation, which is a highly counterintuitive result. This discrepancy highlights the difference between logical reasoning in formal systems, like confirmation theory, and our intuitive sense of evidence. In scientific reasoning, it is important to distinguish between evidence that is directly relevant to a hypothesis and evidence that is irrelevant, but still consistent with the hypothesis. However, confirmation theory does not make this distinction and treats any observation that does not contradict the hypothesis as contributing to the overall confirmation. The raven paradox has important implications for how we understand scientific inference. In science, we often make hypotheses based on observations, and then we test these hypotheses by collecting evidence. But the paradox suggests that evidence that seems irrelevant can still contribute to the overall confirmation of a theory. This raises concerns about what counts as valid evidence, and how we can be sure that we are collecting evidence that genuinely supports or refutes a hypothesis. For example, in the case of the all ravens are black hypotheses, observations of irrelevant objects, like white shoes or green apples, seem to provide confirmation even though they have no direct bearing on the hypothesis. This challenges our understanding of what constitutes scientific evidence and suggests that we need to be cautious about how we interpret confirmation in scientific reasoning. One possible resolution to the paradox is to recognize that confirmation in scientific inquiry is not just about counting individual pieces of evidence, but also about the relevance of that evidence to the hypothesis in question. Evidence that is directly relevant to the hypothesis, like the observation of a black raven, should be given more weight than evidence that is merely consistent with the hypothesis, like the observation of a white shoe. This distinction helps maintain the integrity of scientific inquiry, ensuring that we focus on evidence that directly pertains to the question at hand. Another implication of the raven paradox is the issue of over-confirmation. According to confirmation theory, the sighting of every non-back object that is not a raven contributes to the confirmation of the hypothesis all ravens are black. But this leads to a problem of over-confirmation, where observations that have little to do with the hypothesis are treated as evidence supporting it. This creates an inflation of evidence that may give a false sense of certainty about the theory, even though the evidence is largely irrelevant. The paradox thus raises concerns about how we quantify and evaluate evidence in scientific reasoning. If observations that are clearly unrelated to the hypothesis can still be counted as evidence, then the process of confirming a theory may become disconnected from the real-world evidence that actually supports or refutes the theory. This could lead to situations where a theory appears to be more strongly supported by evidence than it actually is. There are several ways to address the raven paradox and its implications for confirmation theory. One resolution is to refine the way we think about the relevance of evidence. Instead of counting all observations that do not contradict the hypothesis as evidence, we could focus on relevant evidence, observations that directly pertain to the hypothesis at hand. This would align more closely with our intuitive sense of evidence and ensure that we are not inflating the confirmation of a theory with irrelevant observations. Another resolution comes from Bayesian confirmation theory, which focuses on updating beliefs based on new evidence. In Bayesian theory, we assign probabilities to hypotheses and update these probabilities as we gather more evidence. This approach allows us to consider the degree of confirmation provided by each piece of evidence, ensuring that we prioritize evidence that is most likely to affect the validity of the hypothesis. Finally, some philosophers have argued that the raven paradox is less a real paradox than a problem of language. In this view, the paradox arises because we are interpreting the word confirmation too broadly. By focusing on the logical structure of the paradox, we miss the distinction between evidence that is substantive and evidence that is merely consistent with a hypothesis. To resolve the paradox, we could simply revise our understanding of what constitutes valid evidence. Ross paradox. Imagine you are in a courtroom and the judge makes a ruling based on the probability of an event occurring. Suppose the judge says, if it is highly probable that the defendant was at the scene of the crime, then they are guilty. But then the judge is presented with evidence that contradicts this, showing that the defendant was not at the scene, yet the probability of their guilt is still high due to indirect evidence. This is the essence of Ross paradox, a legal paradox that challenges the relationship between probability, causality, and legal reasoning. The paradox shows how probabilistic reasoning can lead to paradoxical outcomes when used to infer guilt or innocence in legal contexts. When probabilities are treated as determinative, we are forced to question the fairness of conclusions drawn from incomplete or indirect evidence. How do we weigh the causal relevance of evidence when it seems highly probable that the defendant is guilty, yet the evidence itself doesn't directly support the claim? Let's dive into Ross's paradox and explore how probability theory and causal reasoning intersect with the complexities of legal systems. Ross paradox was introduced by the philosopher David Ross in 1951 as part of a discussion on the application of probability theory to legal reasoning. The paradox arises from the use of probability to determine guilt in a legal case, particularly when the evidence is indirect or incomplete. Ross used this paradox to explore how probabilistic reasoning could lead to conclusions that seemed unjust or irrational, especially when used in legal decision-making. The paradox is based on the idea that when evidence is highly probable, it is often treated as definitive proof, even if the evidence itself is not direct or causally relevant. Ross's paradox demonstrates the pitfalls of using probability as the sole means of determining truth, especially when complex causal relationships or indirect evidence come into play. The paradox challenges the assumption that probability can always replace direct evidence in legal contexts. While Ross originally introduced the paradox in the context of legal philosophy, it has since been widely discussed in the philosophy of science and epistemology, where it raises important questions about the role of probability in reasoning and inference. Ross's paradox has been instrumental in highlighting the limitations of causal inference and statistical reasoning in contexts that require moral judgment or fairness. The paradox remains an important thought experiment in the ongoing debate over how we should reason about probability and causality in decision-making. The Ross's paradox presents a troubling challenge to the application of probability theory in legal reasoning. At its heart, the paradox exposes how probabilistic evidence can lead to unjust or irrational conclusions when used to infer guilt or innocence. In order to understand this paradox, we need to explore the concepts of probability, causality, and legal reasoning, and how they interact in a way that can sometimes lead to contradictory or unsatisfactory conclusions. Ross' paradox arises from a situation in which a defendant is judged based on probabilistic evidence rather than direct or causal evidence. Let's say a judge is tasked with determining whether a defendant is guilty of a crime based on circumstantial evidence. The judge is presented with evidence that makes it highly probable that the defendant was at the scene of the crime. Perhaps they were seen in the area, or there is evidence linking them to the crime. However, there is also evidence that directly contradicts this, such as alibi testimony or forensic evidence showing that the defendant could not have been at the crime scene. At first, the judge may reason that because the probability of the defendant's involvement in the crime is so high, it is reasonable to conclude that the defendant is guilty. However, this reasoning ignores the causal relevance of the evidence. Although it is probable that the defendant was at the scene, this probability is based on indirect evidence and not on the defendant's actual actions or presence at the crime scene. The paradox lies in the fact that probability is being treated as a substitute for causal evidence, even when the probability is derived from factors that are not directly linked to the defendant's guilt. The key issue in Ross's paradox is the distinction between probability and causality. In legal reasoning, evidence is often treated as either probative, i.e. supporting the hypothesis of guilt, or exculpatory, i.e. supporting the defendant's innocence. However, probabilistic reasoning treats evidence as a statistical measure of likelihood, rather than as evidence that is causally relevant to the event in question. This leads to a situation where inference based on probability can be misleading. In the case of the Ross paradox, the defendant is judged based on the probability that they were at the scene of the crime, rather than the actual causal link between the defendant and the crime. The problem with this approach is that probability does not capture the causal relationship between the defendant and the crime. For instance, a person may have been in the area where the crime occurred, but that does not necessarily mean they committed the crime. The causal inference about the defendant's involvement in the crime is weakened by the use of probability, which cannot always capture the true nature of events. Probabilistic reasoning may lead to conclusions based on indirect or circumstantial evidence that are simply more likely to be true, without taking into account the more direct, causal evidence that might prove the defendant's innocence. This is where the Ross paradox reveals a flaw in the use of probability in legal reasoning. Probability does not always equate to certainty or causality. One of the central issues in the Raven paradox is the idea that legal reasoning should be based on evidence that has a direct causal connection to the defendant's guilt or innocence. This is why we often rely on direct evidence, such as eyewitness testimony, physical evidence, or forensic analysis when making legal determinations. These forms of evidence provide a direct link between the defendant's actions and the crime, allowing for a clearer determination of guilt or innocence. However, in the case of Ross's paradox, probabilistic reasoning becomes a substitute for direct evidence. A judge might decide that, because the probability of the defendant's guilt is high based on circumstantial evidence, the defendant should be found guilty. But this decision overlooks the incomplete or indirect nature of the evidence. For example, even though the probability of the defendant being at the scene of the crime is high, there is no causal proof linking the defendant to the crime itself. The use of probability as a proxy for causal evidence leads to a judgment that might not be morally or legally justified. In the legal system, the difference between probability and causality is crucial. Causal evidence directly links the defendant to the crime, whereas probabilistic evidence provides a statistical likelihood that the defendant is involved. The Ross paradox challenges the assumption that probabilistic evidence can be treated as definitive proof of guilt. showing that it may be misleading or insufficient when used as the sole basis for legal decisions. The Ross paradox also raises important questions about moral fairness in legal decision-making. If a person is judged based on probabilistic reasoning rather than causal evidence, they may be unfairly punished due to the shortcomings of the evidence. For instance, the defendant might be highly likely to have been at the crime scene, but probability alone does not account for the possibility of alternative explanations. In cases where the evidence is probabilistic, the likelihood of guilt should not be treated as proof, and fairness demands that the legal system avoid relying solely on indirect evidence. The paradox challenges our moral intuitions about justice and fairness. It forces us to consider whether probabilistic reasoning can ever be a fair basis for a conviction. Since probability is inherently uncertain, relying on it without sufficient causal evidence may lead to the conviction of an innocent person. The Ross's paradox highlights the dangers of using probabilistic reasoning in cases where moral judgment and individual rights are at stake. It demands that we carefully consider the reliability and causal relevance of evidence before making life-altering decisions based on probability. There are several potential ways to resolve the Ross's paradox and reconcile the use of probability with causality in legal decision-making. One solution is to restrict the use of probabilistic reasoning to contexts where it is directly relevant and causally connected to the defendant's guilt. In cases where causal evidence is available, it should take precedence over probabilistic evidence. This ensures that the defendant's actions are directly linked to the crime and avoids the dangers of over-reliance on indirect evidence. Another solution is to revise the way we handle probabilistic evidence in legal contexts. Instead of using probability as a sole indicator of guilt, we could introduce a threshold of certainty that must be met before a conviction is made. For example, a judge might use probabilistic reasoning to determine whether the probability of guilt is sufficiently high, but they should require additional corroborative evidence before making a final judgment. Temperature paradox. Imagine stepping into a room on a hot summer day. You feel the heat, and it's unbearable. But when you step into a different room with air conditioning, the sensation of temperature changes drastically, and you feel the coolness. Now, imagine entering a room that is exactly the same temperature as the one you just left, but this time, the air conditioning is turned off. This time, you feel much warmer. The paradox here is the difference between objective temperature and subjective perception. Temperature as a physical measurement is constant, but our perception of it is inherently subjective and can vary drastically depending on context, relative comparisons, and even personal sensitivity. The temperature paradox forces us to confront the complexity of how we experience the world and how our senses interpret objective data. If two environments are physically identical, why does our perception of temperature change so dramatically? This paradox asks whether we can ever truly trust our senses to reflect objective reality, and challenges the notion of subjectivity versus objectivity in our everyday experiences. The temperature paradox stems from the philosophy of mind and the study of subjective experience. It explores how our perception of temperature as a sensory experience does not always align with objective physical measurements of temperature. The paradox is often discussed in the context of qualia, the subjective qualities of experience, and how our minds interpret physical phenomena in ways that are deeply influenced by context, expectation, and prior experiences. Philosophers like René Descartes and John Locke have long been interested in the distinction between objective reality and our subjective perception of that reality. Descartes, in particular, posited that our senses could deceive us, and that our perception of the world was filtered through subjective mental processes. Modern philosophers, such as Thomas Metzinger and David Chalmers, have expanded on this idea by exploring how sensory experiences, like the perception of temperature, are not direct representations of external reality, but are instead the result of cognitive processing that involves both internal representations and external stimuli. The temperature paradox raises fundamental questions about how we experience the world around us and whether our perceptions can ever be entirely trusted. It questions the reliability of sense data and asks how subjective experiences are constructed. The paradox is relevant not only to philosophy but also to fields like psychology, neuroscience, and cognitive science, where the relationship between subjective experience and objective reality is a central theme of inquiry. The temperature paradox invites us to reconsider how we experience and interpret sensory data. While temperature is often considered an objective physical measurement, our perception of it is deeply subjective. and varies based on context, mental state, and individual sensitivity. To understand the paradox, we must explore how physical stimuli become subjective experiences in the mind, and why this transformation can lead to seemingly contradictory experiences. Temperature, as a physical property, is typically measured in units such as Celsius or Fahrenheit, representing objective facts about the environment. For example, if you step into a room and measure the temperature with a thermometer, it might read 75 DEGF, 24 DEGC, which represents a concrete, measurable value. However, our perception of temperature is inherently subjective. The temperature paradox arises when we realize that two people in the same room, at the same temperature, might have vastly different perceptions of warmth or coldness. One person might find the room comfortable, while another might find it uncomfortably hot or cold. This subjective variation can be influenced by a variety of factors, including previous experiences, expectations, and even psychological states. For example, a person who has just stepped out of a frigid environment might perceive a room at 75 DFF as warm, while someone who has just been in the sun may find the same temperature uncomfortably cool. This subjective experience of temperature, in contrast to the objective measurement, is at the heart of the paradox. How can temperature, which is supposed to be an objective, physical property, be experienced so differently by different people, or even by the same person in different contexts? One of the key reasons for this paradox is the role of relative comparison in our perception of temperature. Humans perceive temperature not in absolute terms, but in relative terms. If you walk into a room that is warmer than the outdoor environment, you might perceive the room as hot. However, if you've been in a sauna, the same temperature may seem mild or even cool. This relative perception is part of what leads to the paradox. The same physical temperature can feel drastically different depending on what you've experienced immediately beforehand or what you compare it to. For example, after spending time in a hot desert, a temperature of 90 DGF, 32 DCC, may feel like a relief when you step into an air-conditioned space, but in a cold climate, 90 DGF might feel sweltering. This context-dependent nature of temperature perception creates an inherent subjectivity in how we experience heat or cold. The paradox arises because we might have a clear, objective measurement of the temperature, but our perception can still differ widely, depending on our context, prior experiences, or physical condition. Another factor influencing temperature perception is the role of expectation and psychological states. Our expectations about how warm or cold we should feel can influence our sensory experience. For example, if you step into a room that you expect to be cold, but is actually at room temperature, you might still perceive it as warmer than you expect, because your body has been conditioned to expect cold. Similarly, emotional states can also affect how we perceive temperature. Someone who is feeling anxious or stressed may perceive the environment as warmer than it actually is, because their body's stress response can raise their perceived temperature. The paradox here is that perception is not a passive response to the objective environment, but is actively shaped by psychological and contextual factors. Our minds are constantly interpreting and filtering sensory information, sometimes in ways that distort our perception of objective reality. In the case of temperature, we might perceive a room as hot not because of the actual physical temperature, but because of our expectations or mental state. The physical body itself plays a crucial role in how we experience temperature. Factors like skin sensitivity, metabolic rate, and blood circulation can all influence how we perceive heat or cold. For instance, a person with poor circulation might feel colder than someone with normal circulation at the same temperature. Similarly, individuals with higher body fat might experience temperature differently from those with lower body fat due to insulation differences. Moreover, physical acclimatization can affect temperature perception. If you've spent a long time in a hot environment, your body may become acclimatized to high temperatures, meaning that you will feel more comfortable in that environment than someone who is not acclimated. On the other hand, someone who has spent a long time in a cold environment might feel a chill even at temperatures that would feel warm to others. The temperature paradox is ultimately about the difference between objective reality and subjective experience. Temperature as a physical property is clearly measurable, yet our experience of it is entirely subjective. This discrepancy is what makes the paradox so intriguing. While we know that the temperature in a room is a constant value, our individual experience of that temperature can vary significantly depending on a range of internal and external factors. The paradox challenges the assumption that our senses provide a reliable, direct link to the external world. Instead, it shows that our perceptions are deeply influenced by context, experience, and even mental state. In some ways, the temperature paradox echoes other philosophical puzzles related to perception and reality. How do we know that what we perceive as reality is the same as what others perceive? How can we trust our senses if they can be influenced by internal factors? The paradox suggests that our understanding of objective reality is always mediated by subjective experience, and that we must consider the limitations of our senses when making judgments about the world around us. The temperature paradox might be resolved by acknowledging the subjective nature of perception and distinguishing it from objective measurement. While temperature can be objectively measured with instruments like thermometers, our perception of it is always filtered through our individual experience. One resolution could be to focus on objective metrics when making decisions that rely on precise knowledge of temperature, e.g. in scientific research or engineering, while recognizing the subjective variation in temperature perception in more personal or experiential contexts. Another potential resolution is to explore how we can train or modify our perceptions of temperature through acclimatization or other methods. Just as our bodies can become more accustomed to heat or cold over time, it might be possible to train our minds to better regulate or understand our subjective experiences of temperature, leading to a more consistent alignment with the objective reality. Curry's paradox. Imagine a sentence that, if it were true, would lead to a contradiction. It starts with something seemingly innocent. If this sentence is true, then the moon is made of green cheese. Now, take that sentence and twist it just a bit. If this sentence is true, then 2 + 2 = 5. While it might seem nonsensical at first, the moment you accept that the sentence is true, you are forced to accept that 2 + 2 = 5, creating a paradox. This is the essence of Curry's paradox, a paradox that arises in certain formal logical systems when self-referential statements are allowed to exist. Curry's paradox shows how a small tweak in how we handle logical inference can lead to an explosive breakdown in consistency. What does it mean to say a sentence is true, if accepting that truth forces us into contradictions? Curry's paradox challenges the foundations of logical reasoning and self-referencing, forcing us to rethink how we use inference and truth in formal systems. Let's explore this paradox and see how seemingly innocuous statements can unravel the very fabric of logical consistency. Curry's paradox was discovered by the logician Haskell Curry in the 20th century. The paradox arose in the context of intuitionistic logic, a system of formal logic developed by L. Brouwer that focuses on constructive proofs. Curry's paradox shows how, within certain logical frameworks, self-referential statements can lead to contradictory conclusions. The paradox was particularly significant in the study of non-classical logic and fixed-point combinators, which deal with statements that refer to themselves in some way, like, "This sentence is false." Curry's paradox arises when we allow for certain kinds of self-referential statements, which are logically permissible in systems that do not have strong restrictions on inference. By allowing for self-referential definitions, Curry's paradox demonstrates how such systems can quickly lead to explosive contradictions, undermining the consistency of the entire logical framework. Curry's work is closely related to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that no formal system can be both complete and consistent if it is sufficiently powerful to model arithmetic. The paradox is widely discussed in the context of philosophy of logic, mathematical logic, and computational theory, as it highlights the potential dangers of self-rection in logical reasoning. It also raises fundamental questions about the limits of formal systems and truth, suggesting that some systems, when pushed too far, can unravel themselves through the very structures they rely on. The Curry's paradox is a self-referential paradox that occurs in certain logical systems, and it sheds light on the limits of formal reasoning. The paradox shows how a small tweak in how we handle logical inference and truth can lead to profound contradiction. Curry's paradox challenges our understanding of truth and inference in formal systems, suggesting that under certain conditions, accepting the truth of a sentence can lead us into a logical collapse. Let's break down the paradox and explore how it operates. The paradox begins with a self-referential sentence. If this sentence is true, then 2 + 2 = 5. On the surface, this seems like a nonsensical statement. It combines a trivial mathematical fact, 2 + 2 = 4, with an absurd conclusion, 2 plus 2 equals 5, which makes the sentence seem clearly false. But here's the trick. If we accept that the sentence is true, then we are forced to accept that the conclusion, 2 plus 2 equals 5, must also be true, because the structure of the sentence operates on the assumption that if the sentence is true, its conclusion must follow. The paradox arises because we have created a sentence that, when accepted as true, leads to a false conclusion. This type of reasoning leads us into a logical collapse, where truth itself is no longer reliable. By assuming the truth of the sentence, we inadvertently undermine the system of reasoning that allowed us to establish the truth in the first place. This creates a situation where truth and falsity are entangled, leading to contradictions. At the heart of Curry's paradox is the use of self-rexadation, a feature common to many paradoxes in philosophy and logic. In this case, the sentence, if this sentence is true, then 2 plus 2 equals 5, refers to itself in a way that makes its truth conditional upon the truth of the conclusion. If we assume the sentence is true, then we are forced to accept the conclusion, regardless of how nonsensical or false the conclusion might seem. This form of self-resignation is dangerous because it creates a feedback loop in reasoning, where accepting the truth of one part of the sentence forces us to accept something else as true, even when that thing contradicts the very foundation of reasoning. The paradox shows how self-referential statements can short-circuit logical inference and create contradictions in what should otherwise be a consistent system of reasoning. This is similar to other famous self-referential paradoxes, such as the liar paradox, where a statement refers to itself as being false. This sentence is false. The liar paradox leads to a contradiction because the statement cannot consistently be either true or false. Similarly, Curry's paradox shows how self-referential statements can lead to a breakdown in logical consistency, as truth and falsity become tangled in a way that cannot be resolved. The core of the Curry's paradox lies in the concept of logical inference. In formal systems, logical inference allows us to derive new truths from established premises using rules of inference. However, Curry's paradox shows how unrestricted inference can lead to contradictions. If we allow self-referential statements to be part of our system, then we are no longer working within a system that is both consistent and complete. Instead, we enter a realm where any statement can be inferred from a true self-referential premise, leading to an explosion of contradictions. In standard classical logic, we rely on certain principles, such as modular inference and the law of the excluded middle, to maintain consistency. But when we allow for statements like, if this sentence is true, then 2 plus 2 equals 5, we bypass these logical safeguards, leading to the collapse of the system. This is the essence of Curry's paradox. It shows how even a small logical change, allowing self-referential sentences, can cause the entire system to fall apart. Curry's paradox is closely related to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which assert that in any formal system powerful enough to model arithmetic, there will always be true statements that cannot be proven within the system. Gödel's work showed that self-referential statements could lead to paradoxes and contradictions in formal systems. Similarly, Curry's paradox demonstrates that the inclusion of self-referential sentences within a formal system can create contradictions that are impossible to resolve, even though the system may seem consistent at first. Both Curry's paradox and Gödel's incompleteness theorems highlight the limits of formal systems. Formal logic, when taken too far, can lead to contradictions that undermine the very foundation of reasoning. This has profound implications, not only for mathematics, but also for philosophy, epistemology, and the philosophy of language. Curry's paradox is an important thought experiment in the philosophy of logic because it challenges the notion that logical systems can be universally and unconditionally reliable. The paradox forces us to rethink the way we build logical systems, especially when dealing with self-referential structures. It also raises important questions about truth, inference, and the limits of reason. In philosophy, logical paradoxes like Curry's force us to confront the fragility of the systems we rely on to reason about the world. If self-referential statements can lead to contradictions, how can we be sure that our logical systems are consistent in other areas? The paradox also challenges us to reconsider the assumptions underlying truth. Is truth something that can be inferred from any valid system, or is it inherently contingent on the structure of the system itself? The paradox also serves as a warning for formal systems and computational logic. In fields like artificial intelligence and computational theory, where formal reasoning is central, Curry's paradox shows that introducing self-referential constructs into a system can lead to unexpected and undesirable outcomes. It is a cautionary tale for any system that relies on logical reasoning to draw conclusions. One way to resolve Curry's paradox is to impose restrictions on the rules of inference within the system. By disallowing self-referential statements or limiting the scope of inference, we can avoid the logical collapse that arises from the paradox. This is similar to the way type theory was developed to prevent paradoxes like Russell's paradox, which also stemmed from self-referential reasoning in set theory. Another possible resolution is to redefine the concept of truth within formal systems. Instead of treating truth as something that can be derived from any logically valid system, we might adopt a more context-sensitive or hierarchical view of truth that acknowledges the limitations of formal inference in certain cases. In computational systems, restrictions on recursion or the introduction of guardrails around self-referential functions could help prevent Curry's paradox from arising in practice. Epimenides' paradox. Imagine a statement that causes a deep paradox simply by its very nature. In a small village, the philosopher Epimenides says, "All Cretans are liars." This seems straightforward enough, but here's the catch. Epimenides himself is a Cretan. So, if his statement is true, that all Cretans are liars, then he himself must be lying since he's a Cretan. But if he's lying, then his statement, "all Cretans are liars," must be false, which means not all Cretans are liars, implying that Epimenides is telling the truth. This creates a logical loop, where the statement cannot consistently be true or false. This is the Epimenides paradox, or the liar paradox, which is one of the oldest and most famous paradoxes in philosophy. The paradox challenges our understanding of truth and self-reference, raising important questions about the nature of language, logic, and reasoning. How can a statement be both true and false at the same time? Let's explore this paradox and discover the profound insights it offers into language, truth, and the limitations of logical systems. The Epimenides paradox, also known as the liar paradox, was first introduced by the ancient Greek philosopher Epimenides of Crete around 600 BCE. Epimenides, who was a Cretan himself, famously declared, "All Cretans are liars." This seemingly simple statement led to one of the earliest known paradoxes in the history of philosophy. The paradox arises because Epimenides, as a Cretan, is part of the very group he is describing. If we accept his statement as true, then as a Cretan, Epimenides must be a liar, which means that his statement cannot be true. But if his statement is false, then not all Cretans are liars, which means that his statement could be true. This creates a self-referential loop in which the statement cannot consistently be classified as either true or false. The Epimenides paradox has become foundational in the study of logic and semantics, particularly in the field of self-referential and paradoxes of truth. It is closely related to other paradoxes, such as the liar paradox, which appears in various forms throughout history and has influenced the development of formal logic, set theory, and the philosophy of language. The paradox remains a key point of study in the exploration of truth and reference in both philosophy and mathematical logic. The Epimenides paradox is one of the most intriguing and well-known self-referential paradoxes. At its core, the paradox challenges our understanding of truth and logical consistency. The paradox is simple in its structure but has profound implications for our approach to reasoning, self-references, and the foundations of logic. To fully grasp the Epimenides paradox, we need to break it down step by step and explore the implications it has for truth and logical systems. The paradox begins with the statement, "All Cretans are liars," made by Epimenides, the Cretan himself. The statement seems straightforward. It asserts that all members of the Cretan group lie. However, the paradox arises when we examine the implications of this statement. If we accept the statement as true, then Epimenides, being a Cretan, must also be a liar. If he is a liar, then his statement, "All Cretans are liars," must be false. But if the statement is false, it means that not all Cretans are liars, which contradicts the original statement. On the other hand, if we reject the statement and assume it is false, then not all Cretans are liars. But if Epimenides' statement is false, then it suggests that there are Cretans who tell the truth, which could mean that Epimenides himself, as a Cretan, could be telling the truth. This would mean the statement, "All Cretans are liars," is indeed true. Thus, the Epimenides paradox creates a logical loop in which the statement cannot be consistently classified as either true or false. The paradox exposes the limitations of self-referential reasoning and reveals how certain kinds of statements can undermine our ability to reason coherently. At the heart of the Epimenides paradox is the concept of self-referential. A self-referential statement is one that refers to itself, either directly or indirectly. In this case, Epimenides' statement refers to the truth of his own statement. If he is telling the truth, then all Cretans are liars. But if he is lying, then his statement is false. This creates a circular relationship between the statement's truth and its falsity. Self-referential statements are inherently problematic in formal logic because they create contradiction. The liar paradox, a broader version of the Epimenides paradox, operates on the same principle of self-referencing. In the liar paradox, a statement like "this sentence is false" leads to a contradiction because if the sentence is true, it must be false, and if it is false, it must be true. This paradox shows that self-referencing can break the consistency of logical systems, making it difficult to determine the truth or falsity of statements that refer to themselves. The Epimenides paradox illustrates the fragility of our logical systems when they include self-referential statements. This paradox is a precursor to later developments in mathematical logic, such as Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that certain formal systems are inherently incomplete and cannot prove all truths within their own framework. The Epimenides paradox also raises important questions about the nature of truth and belief. In everyday reasoning, we tend to believe that a statement is either true or false. This is known as the law of the excluded middle, which states that for any proposition, either the proposition is true or its negation is true. However, self-referential paradoxes, like the Epimenides paradox, show that this law does not always hold when dealing with statements that reference themselves. In the case of the Epimenides paradox, the statement cannot be categorized as simply true or false, because accepting either outcome leads to a contradiction. The paradox challenges our traditional understanding of truth. Is truth something that is absolute and binary, or is it something that can be influenced by context, interpretation, and self-representing? The Epimenides paradox suggests that truth may not be as straightforward as we often assume, especially when dealing with complex, self-referential statements. Furthermore, the paradox also highlights the issue of belief. If we are confronted with a paradoxical statement like, "all Cretans are liars," how should we adjust our beliefs? Should we hold the statement as true, even if it leads to a contradiction? Or should we reject it entirely? The paradox forces us to reconsider how we handle statements that seem to defy our usual understanding of truth and logic. It asks whether belief systems can withstand the complexity of self-referential reasoning, or whether they must be revised in order to accommodate these paradoxes. The Epimenides paradox has profound implications for the structure and consistency of formal logical systems. In formal logic, consistency is a key property. A system is considered consistent if it does not allow both a statement and its negation to be true at the same time. However, the Epimenides paradox shows that self-referential statements can create logical contradictions, making it impossible to maintain consistency within the system. This paradox is an early example of how self-referential constructs can undermine logical systems. It helped lay the groundwork for Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which showed that formal mathematical systems that are sufficiently powerful, like set theory, can be both incomplete and inconsistent. In these systems, there are always true statements that cannot be proven within the system, and there are statements that can lead to contradictions if taken too far. The Epimenides paradox also highlights the limitations of deductive reasoning, the process of drawing conclusions based on logical rules. If self-referential statements can lead to contradictions, then deductive reasoning may not always be reliable when dealing with statements that refer to themselves. This forces us to reconsider the foundations of mathematical logic and philosophical reasoning, acknowledging that some forms of self-referential may be fundamentally undecidable or inconsistent. The Epimenides paradox also raises questions about the relationship between language and truth. Language is inherently a system of symbols and signs that we use to represent ideas about the world, but when a statement refers to itself, like "all Cretans are liars," it begins to stretch the boundaries of meaning and reference. This self-representation can cause ambiguity in how we interpret the statement, leading to contradictions and logical breakdowns. In the case of the Epimenides paradox, the language itself creates the paradox, suggesting that truth and meaning are not always fixed, but are dependent on context and the way language is used. This has profound implications for philosophy of language, suggesting that meaning is not always clear-cut, and that statements can sometimes refer to themselves in ways that make it impossible to determine their truth value. One possible way to resolve the Epimenides paradox is to restrict the use of self-referential statements in formal systems. By avoiding self-referential, we can ensure that statements do not create contradiction. This approach has been adopted in systems like type theory, which avoids self-referential sets to prevent paradoxes like Russell's paradox and the Epimenides paradox from arising. Another solution might involve hierarchical structures in reasoning, where statements that refer to themselves are placed in separate levels to prevent them from collapsing into contradictions. By separating self-referential statements from other forms of reasoning, we can preserve consistency and avoid paradoxical outcomes. Relling-Nelson paradox. What if a word could describe itself in one context but contradict itself in another? Imagine we create a new word, heterological, to describe words that do not describe themselves. For example, the word small is heterological because it doesn't describe itself. It isn't a small word. Now consider the opposite, autological, a word that describes itself, like short, for a short word, or English for the English language. Here comes the paradox. Is the word heterological itself heterological, or is it autological? If it's heterological, then it describes itself, which means it should be autological. But if it's autological, then it doesn't describe itself, meaning it should be heterological. This is the Relling-Nelson paradox, a mind-bending paradox that emerges from the way we categorize words and their relationships to themselves. It forces us to ask, can words be used to describe themselves without falling into a contradiction? Let's explore this paradox and delve into the complexities of language, self-reference, and categorization. The Relling-Nelson paradox was first introduced by the German logicians Kurt Grelling and Oskar Nelson in 1930. It arose as a problem in formal semantics and the study of self-requisite within the structure of language. The paradox stems from the attempt to categorize words as either autological or heterological, and the logical contradiction that arises when we try to apply these categories to certain words, like heterological itself. The paradox highlights a deeper issue in philosophical logic and linguistics. How do we categorize language in a way that avoids self-contradiction? Especially when a word is used to describe itself. The autological category refers to words that describe themselves, like English or short. On the other hand, heterological refers to words that do not describe themselves, like long, since the word long is not itself long. However, when the term heterological is applied to itself, the contradiction arises. It cannot consistently fit into either category without leading to a paradox. The Relling-Nelson paradox is similar in nature to other well-known self-referential paradoxes, such as the liar paradox, that challenge our understanding of language, meaning, and logic. By addressing the limits of categorization, this paradox underscores the complexity of linguistic reasoning and the difficulties inherent in applying logical structures to language. The Relling-Nelson paradox is a striking example of how self-differentiation and language intersect in complex and contradictory ways. It challenges the boundaries of language categorization, forcing us to examine how we define and apply terms in ways that can lead to logical contradictions. The paradox is rooted in the idea of categorizing words as either autological or heterological, based on whether they describe themselves. To understand the paradox fully, we need to break down the definition of these categories and explore how applying them to the term heterological itself leads to an irresolvable contradiction. In the Relling-Nelson paradox, we begin with two basic categories for words. Autological words. These are words that describe themselves. For example, short is an autological word because it is indeed short in length. Similarly, English is an autological word because it is the name of the English language. Heterological words. These are words that do not describe themselves. An example of this is the word long. Long is not a long word, so it is heterological. In the same way, the word small is heterological because it is not a small word. So far, the concept of categorizing words as autological or heterological seems straightforward. We categorize words based on whether they describe their own properties. But here's the catch. We now need to apply this categorization system to the word heterological itself, which leads to the paradox. Let's consider the word heterological. According to the definition, it is a word that does not describe itself. It is a heterological word because it does not describe the property of being a heterological word. So by this reasoning, the word heterological should be heterological, meaning it does not describe itself. However, this creates a problem. If the word heterological is heterological, then it does not describe itself. But we now encounter the following contradiction. If heterological is heterological, then it must not describe itself. But that would imply that the word heterological is describing itself as not describing itself, which means it is describing itself after all. This contradiction leads to the paradox. The paradox arises from a self-referential loop that is triggered when we try to categorize heterological. When we try to categorize the word heterological as either autological or heterological, we encounter a logical loop. If heterological is heterological, then it cannot describe itself. But if it cannot describe itself, it must be autological, and if it is autological, it must describe itself. The inability to assign heterological definitively to one category or the other results in a contradiction. This paradox shares similarities with other self-referential paradoxes in logic, such as the liar paradox, where a sentence refers to itself and creates a contradiction. In the liar paradox, the statement, "this sentence is false," creates a similar logical problem. If the sentence is true, it must be false, and if it is false, it must be true. Likewise, the Grelling-Nelson paradox reveals how self-representation in language can lead to irreconcilable contradictions, forcing us to question the validity of categorizing language in this way. The Grelling-Nelson paradox has significant implications for the philosophy of language and the logic of categorization. The paradox exposes the limitations of applying rigid categories to language, particularly when the language itself refers to its own properties. By showing that certain terms cannot be consistently classified, the paradox challenges the idea that all language can be categorized into clear, non-contradictory categories. This has important consequences for linguistic philosophy, where categorization is central to understanding meaning. The Grelling-Nelson paradox suggests that our linguistic systems may not always be as precise and consistent as we assume. When we try to categorize words based on properties such as self-reflection, we are forced to confront the inherent limitations of language. The paradox forces us to ask whether language is inherently inconsistent, or whether we need more flexible, context-dependent systems for categorizing terms. The paradox also raises questions about formal logic and the philosophy of semantics. In formal logic, systems are designed to avoid contradictions by strictly defining how terms can be used and how inferences can be made. The Grelling-Nelson paradox shows that even within formal systems, there are limits to categorization when it comes to self-referential terms. The paradox forces us to reconsider how we treat self-referential language in formal logic. Self-referential tool in both mathematics and language, but it can also lead to logical collapse, as we see in this paradox. For formal logic to work, we must either restrict the use of self-referential terms or reinterpret them in a way that avoids contradictions. The Grelling-Nelson paradox illustrates that without proper safeguards, logical systems can be undermined by self-referential constructs, and that careful thought must be given to how language and reasoning interact. One way to resolve the Grelling-Nelson paradox is to adopt a more flexible approach to categorization, where terms like heterological and autological are understood not as fixed categories, but as context-dependent classifications. Instead of treating these categories as binary, we could interpret them as gradual or situational, recognizing that some words might fit into both categories depending on the context. Another resolution might involve limiting self-recognition in formal logic systems, similar to how other paradoxes, like Russell's paradox, are dealt with by restricting the types of sets that can be defined. By controlling the use of self-referential terms, we can avoid the contradictions that arise from statements like, "all Cretans are liars," or the Grelling-Nelson paradox. Hilbert Bernay's paradox. Imagine you're in a world of mathematical systems, where all the rules are well-defined and logical steps seem to work flawlessly. But what if one simple rule, seemingly harmless, undermines the entire system? The Hilbert Bernay's paradox shows us how logical inference can break down when a formal system is forced to accept too many rules. The paradox revolves around the provability of statements in formal systems, specifically focusing on how self-referential statements and infinite chains of reasoning can cause contradictions. In a world where every step is carefully constructed and every rule meticulously followed, the paradox reveals that even logical systems can collapse under their own weight, forcing us to confront the limitations of formal reasoning. What happens when the rules themselves become inconsistent or incomplete? The Hilbert-Bernays paradox challenges our assumptions about the reliability of formal logic and shows how certain self-referential constructs can unravel the very fabric of logical systems. Let's explore this paradox and uncover how infinite regress and self-referentiation can affect even the most rigorous mathematical structures. The Hilbert-Bernays paradox is named after David Hilbert and Hans Bernays, two prominent 20th century mathematicians who contributed to the development of formal logic and mathematical foundations. The paradox arose in the context of formal systems, specifically those that attempt to prove or disprove the consistency of certain statements. Hilbert and Bernays were involved in the pursuit of a complete and consistent set of axioms for mathematics, a project that ultimately led to Gödel's incompleteness theorems. The Hilbert-Bernays paradox deals with the limitations of formal systems and how logical inference can become problematic when systems are too self-referential or complex. It arises from the fact that, in certain formal systems, there are statements that can be provable and unprovable at the same time, leading to a situation where the system's internal rules break down. The paradox highlights the fact that infinite regress or self-referential constructs can undermine the consistency of a system, revealing the incompleteness of formal systems in some cases. While not as famous as Gödel's incompleteness theorems, the Hilbert-Bernays paradox contributes significantly to the study of mathematical logic and foundationalism by showing that even well-defined systems of logic can have limitations. The paradox has been influential in exploring the boundaries of proof theory and the inherent limitations of formal systems. The Hilbert-Bernays paradox exposes an inherent flaw in formal logical systems, particularly when it comes to provability and self-referential reasoning. To understand this paradox, we must first explore the nature of formal systems, the role of logical inference, and how self-referential statements can lead to inconsistencies. This paradox demonstrates that even in rigorous systems of logic, contradictions can arise, showing the limitations of formal reasoning. A formal system is a set of rules and axioms used to generate statements and proofs. These systems are designed to be consistent, no conclusions, and complete, able to prove every truth within the system. A formal system operates on a set of axioms, which are basic, self-evident truths, and uses rules of inference to derive conclusions. The system is assumed to be self-contained, meaning that everything we need to prove a statement is already contained within the system's axioms and rules. The Hilbert-Bernays paradox arises from the limitations of these formal systems, specifically when we apply the concept of provability. In formal systems, a statement is said to be provable if it can be derived using the axioms and rules of inference within the system. However, the paradox shows that there are certain types of statements that, under certain conditions, cannot be proven or disproven within the system. This is a key element of Gödel's incompleteness theorems. One of the key features of the Hilbert-Bernays paradox is the role of self-referencing in formal systems. The paradox arises when a system allows for self-referential statements that refer to themselves, such as, "This statement cannot be proven." These types of statements create a problem because they invoke a loop of reasoning that cannot be resolved within the system itself. In essence, the system is forced to reason about its own limitations, which leads to inconsistency. In the case of the Hilbert-Bernays paradox, we consider a statement like, "This statement cannot be proven within the system." If the statement is true, then it cannot be proven because it asserts its own unprovability. But if the statement is false, then it must be provable, meaning that the system must be able to prove it, which creates a contradiction. This paradox is a direct consequence of the self-referential nature of the statement and exposes the incompleteness of the formal system. A formal system that allows such self-referential statements will eventually be unable to maintain logical consistency. The Hilbert-Bernays paradox shows that self-referential reasoning cannot be fully contained within formal systems, and that allowing such statements leads to an infinite regress of reasoning, where the system cannot determine whether a statement is provable or not. This forces us to reconsider the foundational assumptions of formal systems and their ability to provide consistent truth. At the heart of the Hilbert-Bernays paradox is the study of proof theory, a branch of mathematical logic that deals with the formalization of mathematical proofs. Proof theory aims to understand the structure of proofs and the conditions under which a proof can be derived from a set of axioms. The paradox arises when we examine the relationship between provability and truth. In formal systems, we typically assume that if something is true, it can be proven within the system, but the Hilbert-Bernays paradox challenges this assumption by showing that there are true statements that cannot be proven within a system. This contradiction becomes clear when we consider statements that are self-referential, such as, "This statement cannot be proven." In this case, the truth of the statement and its provability are inextricably linked, but the system cannot determine which is correct, leading to a breakdown in consistency. The paradox highlights a central theme in proof theory, the distinction between provable truth and unprovable truth. In formal systems, a statement that cannot be proven within the system is said to be undecidable. The paradox demonstrates that when self-referential statements are allowed in a formal system, they can lead to situations where the system cannot determine whether certain statements are true or false, thus revealing the inherent limitations of the system. The Hilbert-Bernays paradox is deeply related to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which state that any formal system that is powerful enough to model arithmetic is either incomplete or inconsistent. Gödel showed that within such systems, there are true statements that cannot be proven within the system, and there are statements whose truth cannot be determined at all. This directly ties into the Hilbert-Bernays paradox, as both illustrate the limitations of formal systems in dealing with self-referential or undecidable statements. In fact, Gödel's first incompleteness theorem states that in any consistent formal system that is capable of expressing elementary arithmetic, there are true statements that cannot be proven within the system. The Hilbert-Bernays paradox essentially demonstrates this same principle in a more intuitive way. By introducing self-referential statements into a system, we force the system to deal with statements that can neither be proven nor disproven, creating a logical breakdown. The Hilbert-Bernays paradox has profound implications for computational theory and the design of formal systems. It reveals that infinite regress and self-referential reasoning are inevitable consequences when we allow systems to reason about their own limitations. This has significant consequences for fields like artificial intelligence and automated reasoning, where formal systems are often used to derive conclusions or verify proofs. In computational logic, systems like the lambda calculus or Turing machines must be designed to avoid paradoxes like the Hilbert-Bernays paradox, as they rely on logical inference to operate. The paradox suggests that there are limits to the power of formal systems in reasoning tasks, especially when those systems are tasked with reasoning about themselves. Just as Gödel's incompleteness theorems showed the limits of formal systems in mathematics, the Hilbert-Bernays paradox shows the limits of logical inference in computational systems. One possible way to resolve the Hilbert-Bernays paradox is to restrict the use of self-referential statements in formal systems. By disallowing such statements, we prevent the system from entering the logical loop that causes the paradox. This approach has been used in the development of type theory and other formal systems that avoid self-referential to maintain logical consistency. Another approach is to introduce hierarchical structures in formal reasoning, where certain types of statements, particularly self-referential ones, are placed at different levels of reasoning. This would allow the system to maintain consistency and avoid the collapse caused by self-referential reasoning. Noah paradox. Imagine a world where you know something is true, but you can't prove it, and the moment you attempt to prove it, you invalidate your knowledge. Enter the Noah paradox, which dives deep into the intersection of knowledge, belief, and proof. In this paradox, a person knows a statement is true, but cannot prove it in a formal way without undermining their knowledge. For example, suppose there is a person who knows this statement is true. However, if they can prove the statement using logical steps, it changes the status of their knowledge. Once a statement is provable, it shifts from the realm of personal knowledge to publicly accessible truth, and they no longer know it in the same way. The Noah paradox challenges our understanding of epistemology, the theory of knowledge, by presenting a scenario where knowledge itself becomes a self-referential trap. It pushes us to question, if knowledge must be provable, does this undermine its very nature? Let's explore this paradox and unpack the complex relationship between proof, knowledge, and certainty. The Noah paradox is rooted in epistemic logic, the branch of logic that studies knowledge and belief. It is a modern paradox primarily discussed in philosophical and logical contexts, and it is closely related to the works of philosophers and logicians concerned with the nature of knowledge and how it interacts with formal systems of logic. This paradox arose as an extension of earlier discussions on self-referential paradoxes such as the liar paradox. The knower paradox specifically addresses the tension between knowledge and proof within formal systems. It challenges the assumption that if something is true, it must be provable, a concept at the heart of classical epistemology. The paradox is often framed as a statement like, "I know that this statement is true," but once you try to prove it within the system of logic, you move from personal knowledge to a formal truth. In doing so, the very nature of personal knowledge is compromised because proof transforms it from a subjective belief into a logical truth that is accessible to everyone. Philosophers like Saul Kripke, Richard Montague, and Michael Dummett have all explored the issues surrounding the knower paradox as it relates to knowledge and logical systems, examining the limitations of formalizing knowledge in a way that respects both subjective experience and objective proof. The paradox forces us to consider the limits of formal reasoning and whether knowledge can truly be captured in formal systems without losing its subjective essence. The knower paradox challenges our traditional understanding of knowledge by exploring the tension between personal knowledge and formal proof. In this paradox, knowledge about a statement like "this statement is true" becomes entangled with the act of trying to prove it, which leads to a logical contradiction. To fully understand the paradox, let's break it down on the relationship between knowledge, proof, and epistemic logic. The knower paradox involves a statement that a person knows to be true, but once the person attempts to prove it, their knowledge shifts from subjective knowledge to objective truth. For example, consider the sentence, "I know this statement is true." At first glance, this statement is true. In a personal sense, the person knows it to be true. However, the moment the person tries to prove it formally, the situation changes. Once they prove the statement, it is no longer merely something they know, but something that is provable and publicly accessible. The paradox comes from the fact that the act of proving the statement transforms it from personal knowledge into a universally accessible truth. The person's personal knowledge becomes objective in the process of proving it. The statement that "I know this is true" in a personal sense, but by proving it, the knowledge shifts and it's no longer personal knowledge in the way the person originally understood it. Thus, the paradox arises because the person's ability to prove the statement undermines their personal knowledge. This seems counterintuitive because knowledge, by definition, should involve both certainty and accessibility. Yet in this paradox, proving the knowledge changes the very nature of that knowledge. The core issue of the knower paradox lies in the distinction between knowledge and proof. Traditionally, in epistemology, knowledge is thought of as justified true belief. In this view, a person knows something if they believe it to be true, have evidence for it, and if it is in fact true. However, the knower paradox complicates this understanding by introducing formal systems and the distinction between subjective knowledge and objective proof. In formal logic, a proof is an objective demonstration that a statement is true. Proofs are built on axioms and rules of inference, and they are designed to be universally accessible and verifiable. This stands in contrast to personal knowledge, which is subjective. It is based on an individual's experience and internal justification. The knower paradox shows that when we try to prove a statement that we know to be true, we strip away the personal aspect of that knowledge. Knowledge becomes a matter of formal truth rather than subjective belief. For example, a person may know that 2 + 2 = 4, but once they prove it mathematically, the personal knowledge shifts to something that is universally accessible, verifiable, and no longer tied to their individual experience. This creates a logical conflict, because proof and knowledge are often treated as distinct in formal systems. Proof transforms personal knowledge into objective truth, leaving us questioning whether knowledge can remain personal if it is provable. Can we truly know something if it can be universally proven? This is the heart of the knower paradox. The knower paradox shares similarities with other self-referential paradoxes, such as the liar paradox, where a statement refers to itself in a way that creates a contradiction. In the case of the knower paradox, the statement, "I know this is true," refers to the knowledge of the statement itself. The paradox arises because the act of proving the statement makes it no longer a personal matter. Once proven, it becomes objective, accessible to anyone. This self-referential structure is what creates the paradox. By knowing the statement is true, The person establishes a relationship with the statement that is subjective, but once they prove the statement, they remove that subjectivity, rendering the statement an objective truth. Thus, the self-referential loop makes it impossible for knowledge to remain in its original form. This challenges our traditional understanding of knowledge as something that belongs to an individual and remains subjective. The paradox exposes the inherent tension in epistemic logic between the subjective nature of knowledge and the objective nature of proof. If knowledge is inherently tied to an individual's experience, how can that knowledge withstand the process of proof, which aims to make it objective and universally accessible? Another layer of the Noah paradox is the potential for infinite regress. In order for the person to prove that they know something, they must rely on other knowledge, leading to an infinite chain of justification. For example, in order to prove "I know this statement is true," the person would have to prove that they know something else, and so on, leading to an endless chain of proofs. This problem of infinite regress is closely related to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that no formal system can be both complete and consistent. Similarly, the Noah paradox reveals that in order to justify knowledge, we may need an infinite number of preceding proofs, which undermines the very idea of justified true belief. The paradox exposes the limits of formal systems in capturing the nature of knowledge and highlights the difficulties of creating a logical system that accounts for personal knowledge without devolving into infinite regress. One possible resolution to the Noah paradox is to distinguish between contextual knowledge and formal proof. Personal knowledge is inherently context-dependent and subjective. It is tied to individual experiences, perceptions, and beliefs. Formal proof, on the other hand, is objective and operates within a set of rules and axioms that can be universally verified. By recognizing that subjective knowledge cannot be fully captured by objective, formal systems, we can preserve the idea that personal knowledge is valid even when it cannot be proven in a formal sense. This allows for the coexistence of personal knowledge and formal proof without requiring them to collapse into each other. Another approach is to consider the limits of formal reasoning. Just as Gödel's theorems suggest that some truths are unprovable within certain formal systems, the Noah paradox suggests that knowledge itself may not always fit neatly into the categories of provability and truth. Sorites paradox. Imagine you have a heap of sand and you begin removing grains one by one. At what point does it stop being a heap and simply become a pile? If you remove just one grain, it seems ridiculous to say the heap has ceased to be a heap. But if you keep removing grains, you eventually end up with no sand at all. So where do we draw the line? The Sorites paradox, also known as the paradox of the heap, challenges our understanding of vagueness and gradual change. This paradox arises from situations where small changes don't seem to make a noticeable difference at first, but when those changes accumulate, they lead to a significant transformation. The paradox asks, how can we determine when a vague concept like a heap stops being a heap, or when a bald person becomes a bald person after losing a few hairs? The Sorites paradox raises important questions about how we define and categorize things, especially when gradual changes occur over time. Let's explore this paradox and its implications for our understanding of vagueness, concepts, and the way we categorize the world around us. The Sorites paradox originates from the ancient Greek philosopher Eubulides of Miletus in the 4th century BC, who posed this problem as a way to challenge our understanding of vagueness. The paradox is named after the Greek word Sorites, which means heap. The paradox questions how we can draw precise boundaries in situations involving vague concepts, such as heap, bold, or tall. The classic example is the heap of sand. If you have a large heap of sand and you remove one grain at a time, at what point does it cease to be a heap? In the 20th century, the Sorites paradox became an important topic in philosophy of language and logic, particularly in discussions about the nature of vagueness and the limits of classical logic. The paradox raises the issue of borderline cases, where it is difficult to draw a clear line between categories. For instance, if someone loses a hair, they may not seem bald. The challenge is how to categorize such gradual changes when there's no clear threshold. The Sorites paradox has been a significant topic in the study of fuzzy logic, which deals with reasoning that is approximate rather than fixed and exact. It has also influenced discussions in epistemology, metaphysics, and linguistics, particularly in relation to how we categorize and define concepts that involve gradual transitions. The Sorites paradox presents a challenge to how we think about vagueness and category boundaries. It asks how we can resolve situations in which the change from one category to another is gradual and not easily defined. At the heart of the paradox is the difficulty in deciding where to draw the line between two categories that involve continuous change. To understand the paradox, we need to explore the nature of vague concepts, gradual change, and logical reasoning. The structure of the Sorites paradox. The Sorites paradox begins with the example of a heap of sand. The paradox is presented as a sequence of statements. A large amount of sand constitutes a heap. If you remove a single grain of sand from a heap, it still remains a heap. If you continue removing grains of sand, at what point does it stop being a heap? The paradox stems from the idea that removing a single grain of sand doesn't seem to change the heap. But if you continue this process long enough, eventually there will be no sand left at all. The question is, at what point does the heap cease to be a heap? Is there a precise moment when it stops being a heap? Or is the concept of a heap so vague that it's impossible to draw a clear boundary? The paradox reveals a tension between gradual change and fixed definitions. On the one hand, we want to categorize objects into clear-cut categories, like heap or not heap, but on the other hand, gradual changes make it difficult to say exactly when an object transitions from one category to another. Vagueness. And the problem of borderline cases. The Sorites paradox is fundamentally about vagueness, when a concept does not have a precise boundary and can be difficult to define. Vague concepts like heap, bald, tall, or rich have no clear-cut dividing line. For example, if a person has only 1 or 2 hairs left, we might not consider them to be bald. The problem is that there's no clear point at which they stop being not bald and become bald. The Sorites paradox shows how vagueness complicates our reasoning. We don't have a precise threshold for the transition between a heap and a non-heap, and similarly we lack clear boundaries for other vague categories. This creates what philosophers call borderline cases, where it's not clear whether an object belongs in one category or the other. For example, if you are asked, how many hairs can a person lose before they become bald? The Sorites paradox shows that there's no fixed number of hairs that marks the transition. Each individual hair removed doesn't seem to make the person bald, but after a certain point we recognize them as bald. The paradox highlights how language and categories fail to deal with situations where gradual change occurs without clear distinctions. The problem of gradual change. A key element of the Sorites paradox is gradual change, the idea that small, seemingly insignificant changes accumulate over time to create a significant transformation. If we remove 1 grain of sand from a heap, it still seems like a heap. But after thousands of grains are removed, the sand is no longer a heap. The paradox asks, at what point does the transition from heap to non-heap occur? Is there a definable point of transition, or is the concept itself inherently vague? This problem isn't limited to sand or heaps. It applies to many other gradual changes in our lives and our perception of the world. For example, how many wrinkles can a person have before they are considered old? How much weight can a person lose before they are considered skinny? How much wealth does a person need before they are considered rich? In each of these cases, there is a gradual change in a vague category, but no clear line that divides one category from the other. The paradox forces us to acknowledge the subjectivity of our judgments about gradual changes and challenges us to think about how we define categories in a world where change occurs incrementally. Theories of vagueness and solutions to the paradox. Philosophers have proposed several theories to address the Sorites paradox and the problem of vagueness in language. Some of the most notable theories include epistemicism. This theory holds that there is a precise cutoff for vague concepts, but it is unknown to us. According to this view, there is a sharp boundary between when something is a heap and when it is not, but we simply do not know where it is. Epistemicists argue that the paradox arises because we lack knowledge of the true boundary, not because the concept itself is vague. Supervaluationism. This approach suggests that there is no exact boundary for vague concepts, but that we can still reason about them using a range of acceptable interpretations. According to supervaluationism, a term like heap can be understood in various contexts, and we accept different interpretations of the boundary based on the specific situation. This allows us to avoid paradoxes by approximating the truth of vague concepts rather than seeking a precise boundary. Degree theories. According to degree theories, concepts like heap or bald have degrees of truth rather than a strict true/false dichotomy. For example, a person might be slightly bald, moderately bald, or completely. Degree theories argue that vague concepts can be understood as having varying degrees of application, which allows for gradual transitions without needing a sharp cutoff. Contextualism. This theory argues that the meaning of vague concepts depends on the context in which they are used. In some contexts, heap might refer to a large pile of sand, while in others it might refer to a small collection. Contextualists maintain that the paradox arises because we use vague terms in multiple contexts without acknowledging the flexibility of meaning. Implications for epistemology and logic. The Sorites paradox has significant implications for epistemology, the study of knowledge, and logic. It raises questions about how we can define and categorize the world when many of our concepts are inherently vague. The paradox shows that logic and reasoning can break down when applied to categories that involve gradual change. If we cannot draw precise lines between categories, then how can we claim to know something with certainty? The paradox also challenges our understanding of truth and knowledge. If we accept that concepts like heap and bald are vague, how do we handle the uncertainty in our judgments? This question has far-reaching consequences in moral philosophy, decision-making, and scientific reasoning, where gradual changes often occur and are not easily categorized. Resolving the paradox. Embracing vagueness and contextual flexibility. One way to resolve the Sorites paradox is to accept that vagueness is an inherent part of language and thought. Rather than trying to eliminate vagueness, we might embrace it as part of how we understand the world. By allowing for contextual flexibility and gradual change, we can avoid the paradox and work with fuzzy boundaries rather than rigid categories. In practical terms, this means accepting that some concepts, like heap or bald, cannot be precisely defined. Instead, we can work with approximate categories and reason in degrees. By embracing supervaluationism, degree theories, or contextualism, we can make sense of vagueness in a way that allows for more nuanced and flexible reasoning. All horses are the same color paradox. Imagine a mathematical proof that starts with a seemingly simple premise. All horses are the same color. It sounds absurd, right? But what if I told you this statement was part of an inductive proof that appeared to be logically valid at first glance? The all horses are the same color paradox arises from a flawed argument used in an attempt to prove that all horses must be the same color. The paradox occurs when the inductive reasoning behind the proof is misapplied in a way that leads to a false conclusion. The apparent reasoning behind the proof goes something like this. Start with a set of horses. Assume that in any group of 2 horses they must have the same color. Then use induction to apply this to larger and larger groups, concluding that all horses in the world must be the same color. However, the flaw in the argument comes into play when trying to move from groups of 2 horses to groups of 3. This paradox serves as a reminder of the dangers of inductive reasoning, especially when we make assumptions about how patterns hold across progressively larger groups. Let's dive into this paradox and explore how logical reasoning and induction can sometimes lead us astray. The all horses are the same color paradox, also known as the horse color paradox, is an example of a false proof in mathematics that exploits the concept of inductive reasoning. It was first proposed in the late 19th century as a paradoxical result of an inductive argument. The paradox arises from an apparent proof that uses mathematical induction, a form of reasoning that is often used to prove general statements about numbers or sets. The basic idea of induction is to show that if a statement is true for one case, the base case, and if it holds for some arbitrary case n, then it must hold for the next case n plus 1. This reasoning can be used to prove a wide variety of propositions. However, the all horses are the same color paradox exploits the assumption that the principle of induction can be applied to sets of increasing size, and it shows how the reasoning can go awry when the proof attempts to move from small sets to larger sets, 3 or more horses. This paradox highlights the dangers of inductive reasoning, particularly when the base case is not adequately verified for all cases. It is often cited as a textbook example of a logical fallacy that arises from faulty inductive argument. While the paradox is ultimately fallacious, it serves as an important lesson in understanding how inductive proofs can sometimes lead us to false conclusions if applied improperly or without careful consideration of edge cases. The The paradox is primarily used in discussions of mathematical induction and logical reasoning. The all horses are the same color paradox is an interesting example of how inductive reasoning can be misused to lead to an absurd conclusion. The paradox occurs when a proof based on mathematical induction is applied incorrectly, leading to a conclusion that all horses must be the same color, even though this is obviously not true in reality. Let's break down the steps of the argument, identify where the error lies, and explore its implications for mathematical induction, logic, and probability. The setup of the paradox. The argument behind the all horses are the same color paradox is built on the principles of mathematical induction. The general structure of the inductive proof is as follows. Base case. Consider a set of one horse. Clearly, this set satisfies the claim that all horses are the same color, because there is only one horse, and it is trivially true that it is the same color as itself. Inductive step. Now, assume that for any set of n horses, all the horses in the set are the same color. The goal is to show that the same holds for a set of n plus 1 horses. To do this, we consider a set of n plus 1 horses. Take two subsets of the set. The first subset contains the first n horses, and the second subset contains the last n horses. By the inductive hypothesis, we assume that all the horses in both subsets are the same color. Since these subsets overlap by n1 horses, these overlapping horses must be the same color in both subsets. Therefore, all n plus 1 horses in the original set must also be the same color. Conclusion. The proof concludes that since the base case holds for a single horse and the inductive step works for any number n, it follows that all horses must be the same color, no matter how many horses there are. At first glance, this reasoning seems valid. However, there is a critical flaw in the logic which becomes evident when we apply the reasoning to small sets, particularly when moving from a set of 2 horses to a set of 3. The critical flaw in the inductive argument, the flaw in the all horses are the same color paradox, becomes apparent when we try to move from the case of 2 horses to the case of 3 horses. When there are only 2 horses in the set, the inductive step works perfectly. We have one set of 1 horse, which trivially satisfies the claim that both horses are the same color, and the second set is also a set of 1 horse. Since there is an overlap of 1 horse, it is easy to see that both horses must be the same color. However, when we move to a set of 3 horses, the overlap between the 2 subsets becomes problematic. For instance, let's say we have 3 horses, horse 1, horse 2, and horse 3. The first subset would be horse 1 and horse 2, and the second subset would be horse 2 and horse 3. While horse 2 is the overlap, we cannot prove that horse 1 and horse 3 are the same color based on the inductive hypothesis. The inductive step fails because there is no overlap between horse 1 and horse 3, and thus we cannot use the inductive argument to prove that they must be the same color. This failure reveals the flaw in the inductive reasoning. The argument assumes that the principle of induction applies uniformly across all sizes of sets, but this assumption breaks down when the set size increases beyond 2 elements. In other words, the base case of 2 horses cannot be extended to 3 horses, and thus the entire proof collapses. Understanding the inductive fallacy. The inductive fallacy in the all horses are the same color paradox arises from the incorrect assumption that the inductive argument holds for all set sizes. Specifically, the error lies in the assumption that the proof can transition smoothly from 2 horses to 3 horses. This overlooks the boundary case, where the overlapping subsets no longer allow us to draw a conclusion about the color of all horses in the set. The mistake is subtle, but it illustrates a broader problem in inductive reasoning. When applying induction, we must be cautious about the edge cases. The principle of induction works when the transition from one case to the next is clear and consistent. But in this case, the transition from 2 horses to 3 horses introduces an ambiguity that causes the argument to break down. This is why the base case and the inductive step need to be handled carefully, especially when moving from small to large sets. Lessons from the paradox. The limits of inductive reasoning. The all horses are the same color paradox teaches us an important lesson about the limits of inductive reasoning. Inductive proofs are powerful tools, but they require careful application and a clear understanding of the boundaries of the system being analyzed. The paradox illustrates that we cannot always extend inductive reasoning from small cases to larger ones without verifying the validity of the transition. In mathematics and logic, we must be especially cautious when reasoning about infinite sets, gradual change, or edge cases. The Sorites paradox, the Ship of Theseus paradox, and the Russell paradox all reveal similar issues in reasoning, where seemingly valid principles break down when applied to more complex scenarios. Inductive reasoning, while useful, is not infallible, and we must be mindful of the context and assumptions we make when applying it. Applications and impact of the paradox. Although the all horses are the same color paradox is a simple example, it has important implications for mathematical induction, probability, and logical reasoning. It demonstrates how inductive proofs can sometimes lead to incorrect conclusions if applied improperly, particularly when the proof depends on an unverified assumption about the structure of the set. This paradox also has broader applications in fields like computer science, where algorithms often rely on inductive reasoning to prove the correctness of programs and systems. Understanding the limits of induction is crucial in these fields, where incorrect assumptions about edge cases can lead to bugs or logical failures. Ant on a rubber rope paradox. Imagine an ant crawling on a rubber rope. The rope is stretched out, and the ant begins at one end. But there's a twist. As the ant crawls forward, the rope is being stretched at the same time. In fact, the rope is being stretched so that it grows longer at a constant rate. The paradox arises when we consider, will the ant ever reach the other end of the rope? The paradox might seem straightforward at first, but as we think about the infinite progress the ant must make, things get more complicated. Each time the ant moves a certain distance, the rope stretches, which means the ant has to travel further than before. So, even though the ant is constantly moving forward, the rope's length is increasing, and the ant's progress seems to slow down. How can the ant ever reach the other end if the rope keeps growing longer? The ant on a rubber rope paradox challenges our understanding of infinite progression and distance. It forces us to think about how objects and distances can change over time, and how infinite sequences can still lead to a finite destination. Let's explore this paradox and see how it intersects with calculus, infinity, and probability theory. The ant on a rubber rope paradox is a modern thought experiment that emerges from infinite series and calculus. The paradox involves an ant that starts at one end of a rubber rope and begins to crawl towards the other end. However, as the ant crawls, the rope is being stretched. The paradox is often presented in the context of infinite progression and continuity in mathematics, particularly with reference to sequences and limits. The paradox itself is not a problem that originated from a single philosopher or mathematician, but is often used as a mathematical puzzle that explores the properties of infinite sequences and convergence. The key to understanding the paradox is recognizing that while the ant makes progress, the rope is stretching at the same time, which affects how much the ant advances with each step. The paradox is similar in structure to the Zeno's paradoxes of ancient Greece, particularly the Achilles and the tortoise paradox, which also deals with the infinite division of time and space. However, the ant on a rubber rope paradox provides a more modern context in which the stretching of a rope introduces an additional layer of complexity. Mathematically, this paradox connects to infinite geometric theories and the concept of limits in calculus. The question of whether the ant ever reaches the other end depends on understanding how infinite sums behave when they converge. The ant on a rubber rope paradox explores the relationship between infinite progress and finite distance. The paradox arises from the fact that while the ant is making progress toward its goal, the rope itself is expanding, making the task of reaching the end much harder. Let's break down the paradox and explore how infinite progression interacts with changing distances and limits in mathematics. The setup of the paradox. The paradox begins with the following scenario. Step 1. There is a rubber rope of length L0 and an ant starts at one end. Step 2. The ant begins crawling toward the other end at a constant speed v. Step 3. Simultaneously, the rope is being stretched at a constant rate, so that after some time t, the rope's length is L met equals L0xx plus rxx, where r is the rate at which the rope is being stretched. The question is, will the ant ever reach the other end? On the surface, it seems the ant would be able to reach the end eventually because it's making progress with every step. But the stretching of the rope adds a layer of complexity, and as the rope stretches, the ant must travel a longer and longer distance to reach the end. The paradox asks us to consider how the stretching affects the ant's progress. and whether the infinite increase in distance means the ant will never reach the end, despite its constant movement. Mathematical interpretation, infinite series, and convergence. To understand the paradox mathematically, we need to model the problem using infinite series. Let's assume that the ant's initial speed is constant, and that it moves a fraction of the rope's current length in each step. For simplicity, let's say the ant moves a fraction f of the total length of the rope each second. As the rope stretches, the ant's relative progress is reduced, so its distance covered in each step is a fraction of the increasing length of the rope. Let's break this down into steps. After the first second, the ant covers a fraction f of the initial length of the rope. After the second second, the rope has increased in length, so the ant covers a smaller fraction of the new, longer rope. This process continues, with the ant covering smaller and smaller fractions of the total length with each passing second, as the rope keeps stretching. The ant's journey is modeled as a geometric series. In infinite series, the sum of the distances the ant travels is given by S equals fx L0 plus fx1 plus rxt plus xxl plus 2rxt plus fx1 plus rxt plus fxl0 plus fx. However, the key insight comes from calculus. The sum of this infinite series will converge to a finite value, because the amount the ant covers with each step becomes progressively smaller, even though the number of steps is infinite. The total distance the ant covers will reach a finite limit. Convergence of the series mathematically, we can express the total distance the ant covers as an infinite geometric series. A standard geometric series of the form S equals A plus R plus AR2 plus R3 plus, where A is the first term and R is the common ratio, converges to a finite sum when R less than 1. In the case of the ant on a rubber rope, the series converges because the fractions the ant covers become progressively smaller as the rope stretches, causing the total distance to approach a finite limit. In this case, the total distance d that the ant travels can be calculated using the formula for the sum of an infinite geometric series, d equals a slash 1, where a is the initial distance and r is the rate at which the distance covered by the ant decreases as the rope stretches. Will the ant ever reach the end? Now the central question remains, will the ant reach the end of the rope? The paradox suggests that despite the infinite series and infinite time involved, the ant will in fact reach the end of the rope after a finite amount of time. This is because the total distance the ant needs to travel is finite. The infinite progression of the rope's stretching still results in a finite sum of distances that the ant covers. While the rope stretches infinitely, the fact that the total distance covered by the ant is finite ensures that it will eventually reach the other end. Thus, the answer to the paradox is yes, the ant will reach the end of the rope, but it will take an infinite amount of time for the ant to do so. Implications of the paradox. The ant on a rubber rope paradox is a powerful illustration of the concept of infinite progression and convergence in calculus. It shows that even when a situation involves infinite sequences or endless change, there can still be a finite result. This paradox has several key implications. Infinite processes do not always lead to infinite outcomes. Even though the rope is stretching infinitely, the total distance the ant travels is finite, thanks to the convergence of the infinite series. Limits and continuity are central to understanding real-world phenomena. This paradox helps explain how infinite processes in nature or mathematics can result in finite outcomes when viewed in the context of limits and convergence. Understanding infinite series is crucial for modeling real-world problems that involve continuous change, like growth, decay, and accumulation. This paradox provides insight into how we might reason about gradual change in processes such as population growth, investment, and motion. The role of time and motion. Finally, the ant on a rubber rope paradox also has philosophical implications for our understanding of time and motion. The paradox demonstrates that time and motion are often subject to infinite regression when modeled in continuous systems. Yet the total effect of these infinite regressions can still converge to a finite outcome. It asks us to reconsider our assumptions about infinite time and continuous motion, showing that even seemingly paradoxical situations, like an infinite rope, can lead to a final destination in a finite time. Kramer's paradox. Imagine you are asked to flip a coin, and you're told the probability of landing heads is 50%. Seems straightforward, right? Now consider this. What if you are asked to bet on whether the coin will land heads up, given that it landed heads up last time? Logically, you might expect that the odds of the coin landing heads again are still 50%. But what if, by the rules of the game, the previous outcome is supposed to influence the probability of the next? This is the essence of Cramer's paradox, a seemingly simple yet deeply perplexing paradox that occurs when we try to apply probability theory to conditional events. The paradox arises when we reason about the probability of an event given another event, and our prior knowledge of that event appears to distort our expectations. It raises questions about how conditional probability interacts with our intuitive sense of chance. Does the prior outcome change the odds, or do we fall into a logical trap where the laws of probability appear to fail? Let's explore Cramer's paradox and see how it challenges our understanding of probability theory and conditional reasoning. Cramer's paradox was named after the Swiss mathematician René Cramer, who formulated this paradox in the 20th century as part of his work on conditional probability. The paradox arises when we apply the rules of probability theory to scenarios involving conditional events, situations where the occurrence of one event influences the likelihood of another. The paradox is often illustrated with seemingly simple games of chance, like flipping a coin. Cramer's work delves into the nuances of conditional probability, where the probability of an event occurring is influenced by the outcome of a prior event. However, the paradox exposes a tension between our intuitive sense of probability and the mathematical framework that governs it. Specifically, it questions how the prior knowledge of an event, like the outcome of the previous coin flip, can alter our expectations for the next event. Despite what probability theory suggests, the paradox has influenced discussions about probability theory, logical reasoning, and causal relationships in mathematical philosophy and statistics. It forces us to reconsider our approach to conditional events, and it plays a role in the broader conversation about how we understand randomness and causality. The paradox has applications in areas like game theory, economics, and decision theory, where outcomes are influenced by previous events in often surprising ways. Cramer's paradox involves conditional probability, the likelihood of an event happening given that some condition has already occurred. While this concept is foundational in probability theory, the paradox arises when we apply these rules to situations where we might intuitively expect the outcome to be different. The paradox demonstrates how prior information can alter the expected probability, leading to seemingly contradictory results. Let's break down the paradox, its structure, and the implications for probability theory. The setup of the paradox. Cramer's paradox is typically presented through a simple example, such as coin flipping or other events with clearly defined probabilities. Imagine you have a fair coin and you are asked to predict whether the next flip will be heads or tails. The probability of landing heads is clearly 50%, as the coin is fair. Now, let's complicate things a bit. After each flip, you are asked to bet on the next flip given the result of the previous flip. The question becomes, given that the last flip was heads, what is the probability that the next flip will also be heads? Intuitively, you might think that the outcome of one flip does not influence the next, and therefore the probability should still be 50%. The coin is still fair. This would be the case in independent events. However, Cramer's paradox arises when you consider that conditional probability involves updating your expectations based on prior knowledge, which seems to suggest that the outcome of the first flip does affect the probability of the second flip. The paradox highlights that conditional probability doesn't always conform to our intuitive understanding of independent events, and that prior information can sometimes lead to seemingly paradoxical conclusions. Understanding conditional probability. To understand Cramer's paradox, we first need to grasp the concept of conditional probability. Conditional probability is the probability of an event occurring given that another event has already occurred. This is denoted as PAB, which represents the probability of event A happening, given that event B has already occurred. The general formula for conditional probability is PAB equals PAB/PB, where PAB is the probability that both events A and B occur, and PB is the probability of event B occurring. For example, in the case of the coin flip, let A be the event that the next flip is heads. Let B be the event that the previous flip was heads. The conditional probability PAB is the probability that the next flip is heads, given that the previous flip was heads. Since we are dealing with a fair coin and the outcome of one flip does not affect the next, the probability remains 50%. Therefore, PAB equals PA equals 0.5. This would seem to suggest that knowing the outcome of the previous flip has no impact on the outcome of the current flip, which matches our intuitive understanding of independent events. However, Cramer's paradox emerges when we analyze the problem further and consider infinite sequences of conditional events, leading to surprising and seemingly paradoxical conclusions. The problem of prior knowledge and updating probability. The paradox occurs when we consider that as you keep conditioning on each prior flip, you're updating your knowledge and thus changing the probabilities of future events. For instance, if you know the last flip was heads, it might affect your expectations for the next flip. However, if you keep updating your probability after each flip, the odds of heads appearing might be skewed based on the sequence of outcomes. This is where the paradoxical result arises. After conditioning on multiple flips, your updated probability might not reflect the true 50% chance of each flip being heads, even though mathematically the probability should remain constant. The paradox of infinite sequences and expectation Cramer's paradox becomes particularly puzzling when we apply it to infinite sequences of flips. Consider the following scenario. After each flip, you update your expectation of whether the next flip will be heads, based on the outcome of the previous flip. As the number of flips increases, the probability of the next flip being heads appears to converge towards certain values, based on the sequence of prior outcomes, creating a cumulative influence on the probability. In an infinite sequence, it seems paradoxical that the probability of heads, conditioned on all the prior flips, could approach a value that deviates from the true 50%, even though each flip is independent. The paradox lies in the expectation that conditioning on past outcomes should still yield a probability of 50%, but when you consider a long series of flips, the updated probabilities don't necessarily converge to the expected value of an independent event. Implications for probabilistic reasoning. The ant on a rubber rope paradox and Cramer's paradox highlight the complexities of probability theory and inductive reasoning in situations involving conditional events. The paradox suggests that our intuitive understanding of independent events and probabilistic reasoning may not always align with the formal probability model when conditioning on prior knowledge. This is particularly important in game theory, decision theory, and fields like machine learning, where probabilities are often updated based on prior information or past experiences. The paradox warns us that applying conditional probability without considering the underlying assumptions about independence or sequence can lead to misleading conclusions. Resolving the paradox. Independence and conditioning. To resolve Cramer's paradox, we need to carefully distinguish between independent and dependent events in probability theory. The paradox arises when we mistakenly treat dependent events, where the outcome of one event affects the probability of the next, as if they were independent. By clearly identifying when events are truly independent and when they are not, we can apply conditional probability more accurately. In the case of the coin flips, if we accept that the flips are independent, then the probability of heads on the next flip is always 50%, regardless of prior outcomes. In summary, Cramer's paradox is a reminder that probability theory is a powerful tool, but misunderstanding the relationship between events, especially when it comes to conditioning on prior knowledge, can lead to paradoxical results. Elevator paradox. Imagine you're inside an elevator, and you want to go from the ground floor to the top floor. The elevator starts moving upward, but you're in for a surprise. As the elevator speeds up, you start to feel like time itself is slowing down. How can that be? According to the elevator paradox, when you're inside an accelerating elevator, your perception of time and space changes depending on whether the elevator is speeding up or slowing down. But here's the catch. The paradox lies in how different observers, one inside the elevator and one outside, perceive time, distance, and motion. The paradox connects to relativity theory and the concept that objects moving at high speeds experience time differently. The closer an object gets to the speed of light, the slower time moves for it relative to someone who is not moving. So, what happens when you're inside an elevator that seems to be accelerating infinitely? Does time ever stop? Does the concept of motion break down entirely? Let's explore the elevator paradox and see how relativity challenges our understanding of speed, time, and motion in the most everyday of scenarios. The elevator paradox is not as widely known as other thought experiments in physics, but it serves as an accessible illustration of how the principles of special relativity can lead to counterintuitive effects. The paradox is often discussed in the context of accelerating reference frames, particularly when comparing motion inside an accelerating elevator to a stationary observer outside the elevator. While the paradox itself is primarily a thought experiment, its roots lie in the work of Albert Einstein and his theory of special relativity, first published in the early 20th century. Special relativity revolutionized our understanding of space and time, showing that both are relative to the speed of the observer. The elevator paradox extends Einstein's theory by examining the effects of acceleration on an observer inside a closed system, like an elevator. One of the core principles of relativity is that time and motion are not absolute. For objects moving near the speed of light, time slows down relative to objects that are stationary or moving at lower speeds. This thought experiment asks us to think about what happens when the speed and acceleration of a moving object continue to increase, especially when perceived from different frames of reference. The paradox draws parallels to another well-known thought experiment called the twin paradox, where two twins experience differential time dilation when moving at different speeds. The elevator paradox simplifies the concepts of motion and acceleration to show how these principles play out in familiar scenarios. The elevator paradox is an interesting thought experiment that highlights some of the most counterintuitive principles of special relativity. In this paradox, we examine the experience of an observer in an accelerating elevator and how their perceptions of time and motion are altered as the elevator speeds up. To fully understand this paradox, we need to explore the concepts of relativity, acceleration, and time dilation. The setup of the elevator paradox. Imagine you are inside an elevator that is accelerating upward at a constant rate. The elevator starts at rest and gradually speeds up as you ascend. As the elevator accelerates, you begin to feel the effects of increased speed. From your perspective inside the elevator, you perceive that the elevator is moving faster and faster. However, as the elevator approaches extremely high speeds, something strange begins to happen. Time appears to slow down for you, the observer inside the elevator. Now, let's add a second observer who is standing outside the elevator, watching the situation. From their point of view, the elevator is accelerating upward, but they can still measure its speed and see the increase in velocity. What's critical in this situation is that time behaves differently depending on whether you are inside the elevator or observing it from the outside. This difference in perception of time and motion is the crux of the elevator paradox. Time dilation in special relativity. The elevator paradox is deeply tied to the principles of special relativity, particularly the concept of time dilation. Time dilation occurs when an object approaches the speed of light. According to special relativity, the faster an object moves, the slower time passes for it relative to an observer at rest. In the case of the elevator, as it accelerates, the observer inside begins to approach the speed of light, assuming an infinite acceleration. And as a result, their perception of time starts to slow down. To the outside observer, it appears that time is progressing at a normal pace, but to the observer inside the elevator, time seems to slow as the elevator's speed increases. This is a direct result of the relativity of simultaneity, one of the key tenets of special relativity, which asserts that events that are simultaneous in one reference frame are not necessarily simultaneous in another. From the perspective of the observer inside the accelerating elevator, their frame of reference is undergoing non-uniform motion, so they experience time dilation differently from someone who is observing from the outside. The effect of constant acceleration. To deepen the paradox, let's look at the constant acceleration in the elevator's motion. According to special relativity, if an object accelerates continuously, the perception of time dilation increases as the velocity increases. As the elevator's speed nears the speed of light, the acceleration makes the passage of time inside the elevator slow down. For instance, if the observer inside the elevator starts at rest and accelerates constantly, they will experience time slowing down relative to the outside observer. The paradox arises when you consider that the acceleration never stops. If the elevator continues to accelerate indefinitely, will time inside the elevator eventually stop? Will the observer inside the elevator experience eternity as they approach the speed of light? This infinite acceleration introduces a logical paradox, because theoretically, the observer inside the elevator would never reach the end of their journey. The speed of light would always be an asymptote that the elevator approaches but never reaches. As the elevator's speed continues to increase, the time inside the elevator slows down exponentially, while from the perspective of the outside observer, the elevator moves faster and faster. This concept is related to the asymptotic nature of relativistic speeds. The closer an object gets to the speed of light, the slower time moves for it, relative to an observer who is not moving at relativistic speeds. Relativity of simultaneity and causality. One of the most intriguing aspects of the elevator paradox is its connection to the relativity of simultaneity. In relativity, simultaneity refers to the idea that events that occur simultaneously in one reference frame may not be simultaneous in another reference frame that is moving relative to the first. In the case of the elevator, the observer inside the elevator may perceive that time inside the elevator is passing at a different rate than the observer outside the elevator, creating a distortion of simultaneity. This effect becomes particularly significant when considering causal relationships. If time is moving differently for the observer inside the elevator, then causality itself becomes relative. For example, events that are causally related to the outside observer may appear to be unrelated or out of sequence to the observer inside the elevator, further complicating our understanding of cause and effect in relativistic systems. Practical implications: accelerating objects and space travel. The elevator paradox isn't just a theoretical curiosity, it has real-world implications, especially in the context of space travel and objects moving at relativistic speeds. Imagine a spaceship accelerating toward the speed of light. As it accelerates, the crew inside the spaceship would experience time dilation. Time inside the spaceship would pass more slowly compared to observers on Earth, for instance. If astronauts were traveling at relativistic speeds to a distant star, they would age more slowly than people remaining on Earth. From the perspective of the astronauts, their journey would seem to take a reasonable amount of time, but from the perspective of Earth-bound observers, the trip could take hundreds or thousands of years. The elevator paradox provides a conceptual foundation for understanding how acceleration and velocity affect time and motion, and it underscores the counterintuitive nature of relativity when objects approach the speed of light. Resolving the paradox. The limits of acceleration in reality, the elevator paradox has limits. While the theory suggests that an accelerating object can approach the speed of light, practical constraints prevent us from reaching infinite speeds. As an object approaches the speed of light, the energy required for further acceleration increases without bound, making it impossible to actually reach the speed of light. In the elevator paradox, the infinite acceleration scenario is theoretical, an idealization that doesn't occur in practice. Nonetheless, the paradox demonstrates the power of relativity theory in predicting how time and motion behave at high speeds, and how seemingly counterintuitive effects like time dilation arise from relativistic motion. Interesting number. Paradox. Consider the set of all natural numbers. Among them, some numbers seem to be more interesting than others, such as prime numbers, perfect squares, or numbers with unique properties. But here's the paradox. Suppose we define an interesting number as any number that has a special property. Then the question arises, is the number 1 interesting? According to our definition, 1 could be considered interesting because it's the multiplicative identity in arithmetic. But if 1 is interesting, what about the least interesting number? By this reasoning, we end up with a paradox. If we define the least interesting number as the smallest number that isn't interesting, then this number is interesting because it has a unique property. It's the least interesting. This creates a self-referential loop where the properties of the number contradict our expectations. The interesting number paradox challenges our understanding of mathematical intuition, definition, and self-repsertion in the context of interestingness. How can we resolve the paradox when the concept of interesting itself seems to be circular? Let's explore this fascinating paradox and its implications for logic, mathematics, and the nature of self-reps. The interesting number paradox, also known as the paradox of the least interesting number, is a thought experiment in mathematics that explores issues of self-repsercus, categorization, and the concept of interestingness. It first gained attention as a playful and humorous paradox that arose in the context of set theory and mathematical logic. The paradox was popularized by mathematician and philosopher Kurt Gödel, who explored ideas related to self-repsercus in his incompleteness theorems. While Gödel's theorems mainly focused on the limits of formal mathematical systems, they touched upon issues of self-referency, which also play a role in the interesting number paradox. The paradox itself is more of a philosophical puzzle than a formal mathematical problem, though it offers valuable insights into how we define properties like interestingness in mathematics and logic. The paradox highlights the subjectivity of the term interesting and raises questions about how we define and categorize things. It challenges the assumption that concepts like interesting are clear and objective, showing how self-referential definitions can lead to circular reasoning. As a result, the paradox has influenced discussions on language, logic, and the nature of mathematical properties. The paradox is a thought experiment rather than a serious mathematical problem, but it invites reflection on how our language and reasoning about numbers might be flawed or incomplete when dealing with self-referential definitions. The interesting number paradox is a playful but thought-provoking problem that highlights the challenges of self-referential and categorization in mathematics and philosophy. It involves the concept of interestingness, a term that is inherently subjective and difficult to define in a precise and consistent way. Let's break down the paradox and explore its implications for mathematics, logic, and self-referential reasoning. The setup of the paradox. The paradox begins with a simple premise. We define a number as interesting if it has some special property. For example, prime numbers, numbers divisible only by 1 and themselves, are interesting, as are perfect squares, numbers that can be expressed as the square of an integer. The idea is that certain numbers are intrinsically more noteworthy than others because they have unique, well-defined mathematical properties. Now we ask, what about the number 1? Is it interesting? According to our definition, we could argue that 1 is interesting because it is the multiplicative identity in arithmetic, meaning any number multiplied by 1 remains unchanged. Thus, we might include 1 as an interesting number. However, the paradox deepens when we ask, what about the least interesting number? According to the paradox, the least interesting number would be the smallest number that does not have any special property, i.e., it is the least interesting number because it doesn't have anything notable about it. But here's the kicker. If we define the least interesting number in this way, then this number becomes interesting in itself. It has a unique property. It is the least interesting number, which makes it interesting by our own definition. This creates a self-referential loop where the number that is supposed to be the least interesting is in fact interesting. This contradiction arises because we are trying to define interesting in a way that involves self-reference and circular reasoning. The interesting number paradox illustrates the problem of self-referential definitions. Self-referential occurs when a statement or concept refers to itself, often leading to contradictions or logical puzzles. In this case, the paradox arises because the definition of interestingness depends on the property of being least interesting, which directly refers to the concept of interestingness. Self-referential paradoxes are not new in logic and philosophy. In fact, they appear in many famous thought experiments and paradoxes, such as the liar paradox. The statement, "this sentence is false," creates a contradiction because if it's true, it must be false, and if it's false, it must be true. Russell's paradox. The set of all sets that do not contain themselves leads to a contradiction because it both contains and does not contain itself. In the interesting number paradox, the least interesting number paradoxically becomes interesting because it is defined by the very property that should make it not interesting. This creates a circularity in the definition of interestingness that makes it impossible to categorize numbers as interesting or not interesting without creating contradictions. The role of subjectivity in defining properties. One key issue raised by the interesting number paradox is the subjectivity inherent in the concept of interestingness. In mathematics, we typically define properties like prime, square, or even in precise terms. However, interestingness is a subjective property that can vary depending on the perspective of the person making the judgment. What one person finds interesting about a number might not be interesting to someone else. For example, prime numbers are interesting to mathematicians because of their fundamental role in number theory. But to someone unfamiliar with number theory, prime numbers might not seem particularly interesting. The paradox reveals the difficulty of defining a property like interestingness in a consistent, objective way, because different people might categorize numbers differently depending on what they find significant or noteworthy. In a sense, the paradox illustrates the limits of categorization. When we try to impose a strict classification system on numbers, we run into problems because the categories themselves are inherently fluid and context-dependent. This is particularly evident when we define categories based on self-referential concepts like interestingness, which inevitably leads to contradictions. Mathematical consequences and philosophical implications. The interesting number paradox has profound implications for mathematics and philosophy. It highlights the tension between the desire for precise definitions in mathematics and the subjectivity inherent in many everyday concepts. While we can define numbers based on rigorous mathematical properties, concepts like interestingness defy clear categorization because they depend on personal perception. In mathematical philosophy, the paradox raises important questions about how we define and categorize mathematical objects. For example, is it meaningful to say that a number is interesting if the term itself lacks a clear, universal definition? And what happens when a definition leads to logical contradictions, as it does in the case of the least interesting number? The paradox also touches on the broader problem of self-referency in logic and philosophy. It challenges us to think about how definitions can backfire when they refer to themselves, as seen in other paradoxes like the liar paradox and Russell's paradox. These paradoxes reveal the limits of logical systems and language, forcing us to confront the complexity of self-representation and the implications of circular reasoning, potential resolutions and mathematical contexts. One way to resolve the interesting number paradox is to redefine the concept of interestingness so that it does not depend on a self-referential loop. Instead of defining a number as interesting based on its relative interestingness to other numbers, we could define it based on objective properties like prime status, divisibility, or mathematical relationships. Alternatively, we could accept that self-referential definitions are inherently problematic and that any attempt to define concepts like interestingness will always lead to paradoxes. This would imply that certain aspects of language and mathematical reasoning are inherently ambiguous, and we must be cautious when trying to classify things using subjective properties. In set theory and category theory, mathematicians often deal with similar issues when defining sets or categories that rely on self-referential concepts. Understanding the limits of such definitions is crucial for avoiding contradictions and ensuring that mathematical systems remain consistent. Potato paradox. Imagine you have a bag of potatoes and you're told that the total weight of the bag is 10 kilograms. However, the paradox arises when you remove a small quantity of potatoes, say a handful, and weigh the remaining potatoes. It seems like you should simply subtract the weight of the handful from the total, right? But here's the twist. If you repeatedly remove handfuls of potatoes from the bag, it turns out that the remaining potatoes always seem to weigh less than they should based on the weight of the handfuls you've taken out. How can that be? The potato paradox occurs when we encounter discrepancies in the measurement of quantities, particularly when subtraction doesn't appear to yield the expected results. While the problem seems simple at first, removing a handful of potatoes should logically reduce the weight, the paradox challenges our intuitive understanding of quantity, weight, and measurement. Could it be that we're missing something fundamental about how potatoes, or any other physical objects, can be quantified and measured? Let's explore this paradox and uncover what it tells us about the fundamental nature of measurement and mathematical reasoning. The potato paradox is a lesser-known but intriguing thought experiment that illustrates issues in measurement and quantity in a seemingly straightforward scenario. While not widely recognized in formal philosophical or mathematical literature, the paradox is often cited in discussions about quantity estimation, measurement errors, and the unexpected consequences of removing parts from a whole. The paradox likely arises from the complexity of estimating quantities in everyday life and the common assumptions we make about subtraction and measurement. The example with potatoes plays on the intuition that when an object is removed from a whole, the subtraction of the weight should be straightforward. However, the paradox challenges this by revealing how seemingly simple actions can lead to unexpected results in measurement. Though the potato paradox does not have a formal origin like Zeno's paradoxes or the liar paradox, it connects to everyday phenomena that expose gaps in our understanding of physical measurement and quantitative reasoning. The paradox can also serve as a teaching tool for illustrating common errors in estimation and logic when dealing with real-world quantities. In the context of mathematical logic and philosophy, the paradox reminds us that intuitive reasoning about physical objects or quantitative processes may not always align with mathematical or scientific principles, especially when we fail to account for all variables involved in a measurement process. The potato paradox is a thought experiment that, on the surface, seems trivial, but actually uncovers important insights about measurement, quantity, and subtraction in everyday contexts. The paradox explores the idea that subtraction, a fundamental operation in mathematics, can yield surprising or unexpected results when applied to physical objects, like potatoes. Let's break down the paradox step by step and explore the implications for logical reasoning and mathematical intuition. The setup of the paradox. The potato paradox begins with a simple setup. You have a bag of potatoes that weighs 10 kilograms. The problem arises when you start removing small quantities, such as handfuls, of potatoes from the bag. Let's say each handful weighs about 500 grams. Now, after you remove one handful, you might expect the bag to weigh 9.5 kilograms, right? But in practice, the remaining weight often appears to be less than expected. For instance, you might continue removing handfuls of potatoes, and every time you subtract, the remaining weight is always less than what you would expect based on the original weight of the bag and the handfuls removed. This seems like a paradox, because the amount removed should match the difference between the original weight and the remaining weight. The paradox challenges the assumption that simple subtraction will always lead to a logical result. In fact, the paradox arises because when quantities are removed from an object, there are often hidden complexities involved in measurement that don't appear in everyday logic. The role of estimation and subtraction, the potato paradox, highlights the problem of estimating quantities in a way that's dependent on imperfect measurement. When you remove a handful of potatoes, you are making a rough estimate of the weight of that handful. However, this estimate may not be accurate due to several reasons. Irregular shape of potatoes. Potatoes have uneven shapes, and different handfuls may contain a different number of potatoes, leading to inconsistencies in how much is removed each time. Variation in size. Potatoes vary in size, so the weight of each handful can fluctuate depending on whether you've grabbed mostly small potatoes or mostly large ones. Measurement errors. When using scales to weigh the remaining potatoes, small errors in measurement can accumulate and cause discrepancies. These inconsistencies, while not usually noticeable in everyday life, become significant when we consider them over multiple rounds of removal. In essence, the paradox arises because the subtraction of weight does not account for all these variables and leads to an unexpected discrepancy between the expected weight and the observed weight. These hidden variables and the problem of exact measurement. The paradox also serves as a reminder of the complexity of measuring real-world objects. While subtraction is a straightforward mathematical operation, applying it to real-world quantities often introduces hidden variables that affect the accuracy of the result. Some of these variables include humidity. Potatoes absorb moisture, and their weight may change depending on environmental conditions. As you remove potatoes, you may also remove some moisture, which further complicates the expected weight of the remaining potatoes. Texture and density. Potatoes have varying densities based on their type and age. Some may be denser than others, meaning they weigh more despite appearing similar in size. As a result, the removal of a handful of potatoes doesn't always reduce the weight in a straightforward, predictable manner. Instead, each handful may involve slight variations in both weight and density, which accumulate over time, leading to a discrepancy between the expected weight and the actual weight. Mathematical and philosophical implications. At its core, the potato paradox is about the difficulty of applying abstract mathematical operations like subtraction to real-world phenomena. In mathematics, subtraction is a precise operation. If you subtract 500 grams from 10 kilograms, you should get 9.5 kilograms. However, in the real world, measurement is not always precise due to the complexity of physical objects and the imperfections in how we quantify them. The paradox invites us to think about how we apply mathematical models to physical systems. It is easy to assume that mathematical operations like subtraction are always accurate. But in reality, the accuracy of our measurements is often dependent on the context and the system in which we are working. This is particularly true when dealing with natural objects like potatoes, where variation and complexity are inherent. The potato paradox also touches on a central theme in philosophy of science and epistemology. the idea that our knowledge of the world is often imperfect and subject to approximation. While mathematics provides precise rules, applying these rules to the physical world often involves approximations that introduce errors. The paradox forces us to confront the limits of our perceptual and measurement abilities, even when working with simple quantities. The paradox and its connection to real-world scenarios. The potato paradox can be seen as an analogy for many real-world situations where estimation and measurement errors lead to unexpected results. For example, economics. When governments or businesses try to estimate the impact of economic policies, they may use models that involve quantitative subtraction, subtracting costs from revenues. However, small changes in the underlying assumptions, like inflation rates or consumer behavior, can lead to significant discrepancies between expected and real outcomes. Environmental science. Estimating the carbon footprint of a company or country involves many variables and assumptions. As in the potato paradox, small errors or unknown factors can accumulate, leading to measurements that don't align with expectations. Medical studies. In clinical trials, researchers often subtract one group's results from another to determine the effectiveness of a drug. But differences in participants, sample sizes, or environmental factors can lead to unexpected or seemingly contradictory results. In these cases, the potato paradox serves as a metaphor for how even small inaccuracies in measurement or assumptions can lead to surprising outcomes when trying to quantify real-world systems. Resolving the paradox. Precision in measurement. To resolve the potato paradox, we must acknowledge that real-world measurements are often imperfect and subject to many variables. In practical terms, the paradox highlights the importance of accurate measurements and understanding the context in which those measurements are taken. One solution to the paradox is to account for all relevant factors when estimating quantities. In the case of the potatoes, this could involve using more precise scales, taking multiple measurements, and considering factors like moisture content and density. Additionally, in situations involving real-world measurement, it is crucial to understand the limits of our tools and methods. Recognizing that all measurements come with error margins and understanding how those errors accumulate over time can help us make better decisions and avoid the paradoxical results that arise from oversimplifying complex systems. Abelson's paradox. Imagine you are about to make a decision based on the outcome of a random event, such as drawing a card from a deck. The outcome seems entirely uncertain, yet, in the context of Abelson's paradox, you might find yourself overriding your probability calculations due to a sense of psychological bias or decision theory logic. The paradox shows that, while we often approach decisions based on calculated probabilities, human behavior can create irrational decisions when it comes to risk and uncertainty. This paradox arises from decision theory and probability calculations, where the optimal choice based on statistical probability contradicts what people intuitively choose when faced with real-life outcomes. Suppose you are offered a gamble with a known probability, but something about the setup or the framing of the gamble leads you to make a choice that violates the laws of probability. How can an event with fixed odds lead to a paradoxical outcome? Abelson's paradox helps us understand the discrepancy between mathematical probability and human decision-making, and how biases affect the choices we make. Let's explore this paradox and see how rationality and irrationality interact in the world of decision-making. Abelson's paradox is named after Robert Abelson, a psychologist and researcher in the field of decision theory. Abelson introduced the paradox in the context of psychological biases and human behavior when making decisions based on probability theory. His work explored the ways in which humans interpret probabilities and how these interpretations often lead to irrational or counterintuitive decisions. Abelson's paradox is primarily concerned with the gap between expected outcomes based on objective probability and the choices people actually make when faced with decisions under uncertainty. The paradox shows that, while decision theory suggests that we should always make decisions based on calculated probabilities, human psychology often distorts these decisions due to biases like loss aversion, framing effects, and subjective probability. The paradox is a significant contribution to behavioral economics, a field that studies how psychological factors influence economic decision-making. It highlights the tension between mathematical models of probability and the real-world application of those models, where human beings do not always behave rationally. Abelson's paradox has influenced fields ranging from psychology to marketing and finance, offering important insights into why people often make decisions that do not align with the probability theory they are supposed to follow. Abelson's paradox demonstrates the intersection between mathematical probability and psychological decision-making, highlighting how human biases distort rational decisions. The paradox arises when individuals fail to make the optimal decision based on calculated probabilities and instead succumb to psychological tendencies that contradict the laws of chance. To understand the paradox, we need to explore probability theory, decision theory, and how they apply to real-world situations. The setup of the paradox, the Abelson paradox, can be described with a simple gambling scenario. Suppose you are given two options in a decision-making situation. Option 1, a guaranteed win of $100, 0 cents. Option 2, a gamble where there is a 50% chance of winning $200, 0 cents, and a 50% chance of winning nothing. At first glance, option 1 seems to offer certainty. You are guaranteed to win $100, 0 cents. However, option 2 is a gamble that offers a 50% chance of $200, 0 cents, which on average offers a higher expected value than option 1. In other words, mathematically, the expected value of option 2 is expected value of option 2 equals 0.5 x 200 plus 0.5 x 0 plus 100. Expected value of option 2 equals 0.5 x 0 plus 100 plus 0.5 equals 100. This is the same as the guaranteed win in option 1. From a purely mathematical standpoint, these two options are equally rational. However, the Abelson paradox arises when we account for the fact that in real life, people often make decisions that do not follow this probabilistic logic. Psychological factors in decision-making. Despite the mathematical equivalence of the two options, human decision-making is not always rational. Abelson's paradox shows that people are often swayed by psychological factors that lead them to choose one option over the other, even if it goes against the mathematical odds. Some of the key psychological influences at play include loss aversion. People tend to fear losses more than they value equivalent gains. The idea of potentially winning nothing in option 2, despite its higher expected value, might cause someone to prefer the certainty of option 1, even though it offers no real advantage in terms of expected value. Framing effects. The way a decision is presented can influence the choice people make. If the gamble in option 2 is framed as a risky option, people might be more likely to avoid it. Conversely, if the guaranteed win is presented as a sure thing, people might prefer the certainty even if the gamble is mathematically equivalent. Overconfidence. Some individuals might overestimate their ability to predict outcomes or believe that they can influence the results of a gamble. This bias can lead to decisions that seem irrational from a probability perspective. Risk aversion. People who are risk-averse tend to prefer options that offer certainty, even when the expected value is the same as a gamble. Option 1 might seem safer because it provides no risk of losing, while option 2, with its 50% chance of winning nothing, could be seen as undesirable. The paradox in action. Why do people avoid gambles? The Abelson paradox shows that people do not always make decisions based on expected value. Even if the mathematical probabilities suggest that a gamble is equal to or better than a guaranteed outcome, people often choose the certainty of a fixed reward. This preference for certainty, even when the expected outcomes are the same, demonstrates a contradiction between probability theory and human psychology. In the case of the gamble, even though option 2 offers a 50% chance of a larger reward, people may prefer option 1, the guaranteed $100, 0 cents, because they fear the potential loss of getting nothing in option 2. This reflects loss aversion, a concept from behavioral economics, which states that the pain of losing is psychologically more powerful than the pleasure of gaining the same amount. The paradox is that the individual's preference for certainty, even in the face of identical expected outcomes, is a logical inconsistency when viewed through the lens of mathematical probability theory, the role of expected utility in decision theory. In decision theory, expected utility is used to model decision-making under uncertainty. While expected value looks at the average outcome of a gamble, expected utility takes into account individual preferences and how much utility or satisfaction a person derives from different outcomes. In the case of the Abelson paradox, expected utility theory would suggest that a person should make decisions based on their personal preferences for risk, loss, and gain, even if the expected values are equal. For instance, option 2, while offering the same expected value as option 1, may offer diminishing returns to someone who is risk-averse. This means the psychological utility of a 50% chance of winning $200 0 cents might not be worth the psychological pain of losing the bet. The paradox illustrates that decision-making is influenced by personal biases, and probability theory alone cannot fully explain human choices. The paradox of rationality and irrationality. The Abelson paradox forces us to confront the tension between rationality and irrationality in human decision-making. It demonstrates that while mathematical probability is grounded in logic, human psychology often introduces irrational factors that skew decision-making. The paradox invites us to reconsider the idea of rational decision-making and whether mathematical models can fully account for how people actually make choices in the real world. One key lesson of the paradox is that rational decision-making is not always about maximizing the expected outcome, but rather about aligning choices with personal preferences, emotions, and the psychological weight we assign to losses versus gains. In practice, people may overvalue certainty and avoid risk, even when the math suggests that taking the risk would be equally or more beneficial. Applications of Abelson's paradox in real life. The Abelson paradox has practical implications for marketing, finance, and game theory. It helps explain why people might choose safe investments over higher risk opportunities with the same expected return. It also sheds light on why gamblers might repeatedly choose riskier bets, even when they have better odds of winning with safer options. In marketing, companies often exploit loss aversion by framing deals in terms of what consumers will lose rather than what they will gain. For example, a marketing campaign that promises customers will save money by purchasing a product is more effective than one that highlights the product's value or benefits. In finance, understanding the psychology of risk can help investors make better decisions about their portfolios and manage their emotions when markets are volatile. The paradox also plays a role in the design of economic models that seek to incorporate human psychology alongside traditional mathematical economics. Accuracy paradox. Imagine you're measuring the height of a building and you use a tape measure to get a result. The more precise your measurements are, the more confident you feel about the result, right? But what if I told you that the greater the accuracy with which you measure, the more uncertain the outcome becomes? This is the essence of the accuracy paradox, a situation where greater precision leads to greater uncertainty. It seems counterintuitive. Wouldn't more accuracy yield a more reliable result? In certain contexts, however, increasing accuracy can lead to misleading conclusions about how reliable the measurements actually are. For instance, in scientific measurements, statistical data, or estimations, trying to get a number that is too precise can highlight measurement errors that are otherwise negligible. This paradox challenges our intuitive understanding of precision and certainty, revealing that sometimes less precise results might actually be more accurate in a practical sense. The accuracy paradox underscores the complexity of measurement, especially when precision exceeds the limitations of the data or tools used. Let's explore this paradox and how it affects our understanding of reliability, error, and statistics. The accuracy paradox is a thought experiment that originates in the fields of measurement theory, statistics, and philosophy of science. It arises from the practical observation that increasing the accuracy of a measurement does not always lead to a better or more reliable result. Instead, it can expose unaccounted-for variables and small errors that may cause the measurement to appear more uncertain or imprecise than it is. The paradox highlights the interplay between precision and uncertainty in the context of scientific measurements and data. The paradox has its roots in quantitative measurement systems and was first explored in the 19th and 20th centuries by philosophers of science and statisticians. It challenges the assumption that more accurate tools and methods naturally lead to more reliable data. Instead, it points out that error margins can become more significant as measurement precision increases, especially in contexts where the data is inherently noisy or when statistical error is involved. The accuracy paradox is often linked to the concept of measurement error in statistics. It has been discussed in contexts like scientific experiments, economic modeling, survey data, and even machine learning, where highly precise measurements sometimes overestimate the confidence in the results. The paradox offers insights into how we interpret data and the trade-off between accuracy and reliability in different fields of inquiry. The paradox is also related to a broader philosophical discussion on epistemology, the study of knowledge. particularly concerning how we interpret and measure reality. It serves as a cautionary tale against the overvaluation of extreme precision, without considering uncertainty and contextual factors. The accuracy paradox brings to light an intriguing contradiction between precision and reliability in measurements, showing that sometimes the more precise we try to be, the less accurate our results might appear. This paradox underscores the relationship between measurement errors, statistical noise, and the confidence we place in our data. Let's delve into how the paradox unfolds and how it can affect our understanding of reliability in various fields of study. The setup of the paradox. The paradox begins with the assumption that increasing precision should lead to better, more accurate results. For instance, if you're measuring the height of a building, you might use a tape measure. If you measure it once and get a result of 100 meters, you might feel confident about your measurement. But what if you decide to measure it with greater precision, say to the millimeter? The more precise your measurements become, the more likely you are to notice small errors in your tools or methods, which might lead to a larger margin of uncertainty in the result. For example, consider a scientist trying to measure the temperature of a liquid. If the thermometer is only accurate to within 1 degree Celsius, the result might be reliable enough for most purposes. However, if the thermometer is accurate to 0.001 degrees Celsius, the minute fluctuations in temperature might create statistical noise or reveal unaccounted for errors that would have been negligible at a coarser level of precision. In this scenario, the paradox emerges. Greater precision brings with it greater uncertainty, because we are now measuring smaller and more insignificant differences that were previously overlooked. The nature of measurement error. At the heart of the accuracy paradox is the idea that measurement error is inherent in every physical system and data collection process. The more precisely we measure, the greater the likelihood that errors or inconsistencies become apparent. This is especially true in scientific measurements, where instruments often have inherent limitations and calibration issues. When measuring something with extreme precision, small factors that were once insignificant can begin to affect the outcome. For instance, in scientific experiments, the environmental conditions, such as temperature fluctuations, air pressure, or even instrument drift, can introduce noise into the measurement. As the measurement becomes more precise, the effects of these small errors can no longer be ignored. This leads to larger apparent errors in the result, even though the measurement tool itself is more accurate. An example of this can be seen in satellite imaging for geographical surveys. If a satellite measures the distance between 2 points on Earth with an accuracy of 1 meter, it might be sufficient for most mapping applications. But as the technology improves to measure distances with an accuracy of 1 millimeter, small errors caused by atmospheric conditions or slight calibration discrepancies could introduce larger uncertainties that weren't noticeable at the coarser measurement level. Thus, the accuracy paradox is directly tied to the idea that measurement error increases when we attempt to achieve greater precision without properly accounting for the inherent uncertainties in the measurement system. The paradox in statistical data, the accuracy paradox, becomes more pronounced in the context of statistical data analysis. In fields like economics, medicine, and social science, researchers often strive for precise data collection to make informed decisions or draw valid conclusions. However, as the data collection process becomes more precise, the uncertainty surrounding the interpretation of the data also increases. For example, in survey sampling, a small random sample might be used to estimate the opinions of a larger population. If we increase the sample size, the accuracy of the estimate improves and the confidence intervals become narrower. But if we continue to gather highly precise data from larger and larger groups, the statistical noise introduced by small random errors, such as non-response bias or measurement inconsistencies, can make the results appear less reliable than if the data were kept to a simpler, more generalized measure. In machine learning models, the accuracy paradox also plays a role. As models become more precise and trained on large datasets, small errors in the data, such as outliers or incomplete records, can distort the outcome and lead to predictions that are less reliable. Therefore, increasing the precision of the model doesn't always improve its accuracy. It can actually make it more sensitive to small errors and create overfitting, statistical noise, and the diminishing returns of precision. The paradox also highlights the concept of diminishing returns in measurement. The more precise we try to be, the more statistical noise we uncover. This noise often represents the inherent uncertainty that is present in the data or system being measured. At a certain point, increasing the precision of measurement only brings to light minor fluctuations or background noise, making the measurements less useful for practical purposes. For example, in weather forecasting, the precision of the model might improve with the collection of more data and finer grids. However, the more data the model includes, the more volatile the predictions can become, especially if they are influenced by unpredictable factors like local climate shifts or temporary atmospheric changes. In this case, a more generalized weather forecast that doesn't try to predict conditions down to the hour might actually provide a more reliable and accurate prediction for most people. Practical implications and resolution of the paradox. To resolve the accuracy paradox, we need to balance precision and accuracy in measurement. The paradox is a reminder that precision is not always equivalent to accuracy, especially when dealing with real-world systems that involve numerous unpredictable factors. The key to resolving the paradox is to recognize the limits of measurement systems and to understand when finer precision becomes unnecessary or even counterproductive. In many cases, a coarser measure may be more reliable and practical. For instance, measuring the length of a table to the nearest millimeter may be unnecessary unless it's part of a high-precision engineering project. For most everyday purposes, rounding to the nearest centimeter is sufficient and provides a more useful measurement. Another important takeaway from the accuracy paradox is the need for contextual awareness when interpreting data. When interpreting statistical results or scientific findings, it's essential to consider the accuracy of the measurement system and how small errors can accumulate over time. Being overly focused on precision without understanding its limitations can lead to misleading conclusions. Bergson's paradox. Imagine a situation where two factors, A and B, are correlated in a population. But when you start looking at a subset of the population, say those who have been diagnosed with a certain disease, the correlation between A and B disappears or even reverses. This seems strange, right? You might assume that two factors should always be correlated if they are in the broader population. This is the essence of Bergson's paradox, a statistical anomaly where conditional probability and sampling bias create the illusion of a spurious relationship between two variables. The paradox arises when we only study a subgroup of a larger population, such as patients with a specific condition, and the correlation that existed in the general population seems to vanish or even become negative. Bergson's paradox highlights how selection bias can distort the relationship between variables, making us question the validity of conclusions drawn from specific subsets of data. How can we trust the correlations we observe if they are influenced by the way we select or filter our sample? Let's explore this paradox and see how it challenges our understanding of causality, probability, and statistical inference. Bergson's paradox is named after Joseph Bergson, an American statistician who first identified this paradox in the 1940s. Bergson was working with statistical data related to medical studies, particularly in the area of clinical research. He noticed that when researchers look at a sample of patients who have a particular disease, certain statistical relationships between variables could appear quite different than they did in the general population. This phenomenon, which Bergson pointed out, arises when a sample is not randomly selected, but instead consists of people who share a certain characteristic, like a disease or condition. Bergson's paradox highlights a fundamental issue in statistical inference: selection bias. In many cases, researchers unknowingly create biased samples by selecting certain subsets of data, which can lead to misleading conclusions. For example, in a clinical study, researchers might focus on patients who have a particular disease and exclude those who do not. When looking only at the patients who have the disease, correlations between risk factors may seem to change, giving a distorted view of the relationship between variables. Bergson's work contributed to the field of epidemiology and biostatistics, providing an important insight into how biases in sampling can influence the results of statistical studies. Understanding Bergson's paradox has become essential for researchers in public health, medicine, and social sciences, where conclusions are often drawn based on non-random samples. Bergson's paradox is a powerful reminder that statistical correlations can be heavily influenced by the way we collect data. In this paradox, selection bias creates the illusion that two variables are not related, when in fact they are correlated in the broader population. The paradox raises critical questions about causality, probability, and the interpretation of statistical relationships when working with conditional probabilities. The setup of Bergson's paradox. Imagine you are studying the relationship between two factors, let's say factor A and factor B, in a population. Initially, you find that these two factors are positively correlated in the general population. However, when you limit your study to a subgroup of individuals, such as those who are already diagnosed with a certain disease or condition, you notice that the correlation between the two factors either disappears or even reverses. The paradox arises because the sample you are examining is no longer representative of the general population. When you condition on a specific characteristic, such as having the disease, the sample is biased, and the apparent relationship between the variables changes. This creates a misleading statistical conclusion that the relationship between the two variables may not exist, or may be the opposite of what you initially observed. This is where Bergson's paradox becomes important. Selection bias, due to conditional probabilities, can distort our understanding of correlations and causal relationships. The role of selection bias in conditional probability. The key to understanding Bergson's paradox is the concept of selection bias. Selection bias occurs when the way you select your sample distorts the true relationship between variables. In Bergson's case, this occurs when we select a sample based on some condition or outcome, like the diagnosis of a disease. In probability theory, conditional probability is the probability of an event occurring given that another event has already occurred. In Bergson's paradox, we are conditioning on the presence of a disease, which affects the probability of the other variable occurring. If we have two variables A and B, and we condition on a third variable, say C, the disease, the relationship between A and B may change due to the restricted nature of the sample. Let's break this down mathematically. Suppose the probability of A and B being correlated in the general population is represented as PAB. But when we condition on the disease, the probability becomes PABC. In some cases, this conditioned probability might differ from the general probability, and Bergson's paradox occurs when this difference distorts the correlation, leading to the illusion of no correlation or a reversed correlation within the conditioned group. The classic example: disease and risk factors. A common example used to explain Bergson's paradox involves a medical study of the relationship between two risk factors, say smoking and lung disease. Suppose you have data showing that smoking and lung disease are correlated in the general population, with smokers being more likely to develop lung disease. Now, imagine that you conduct a study of patients who already have lung disease. This is the selection part of the paradox. You find that among these patients, smoking and lung disease are no longer correlated, or perhaps even seem to be negatively correlated, i.e., non-smokers are more likely to have lung disease. Why does this happen? When you only look at patients with lung disease, you are excluding those who don't have the disease. The patients who don't have the disease are missing from your sample, and this skews the relationship between smoking and lung disease. In the general population, smoking increases the risk of lung disease. However, in your sample of patients with lung disease, there might be other factors at play, such as the severity of the disease or genetic predispositions, that weaken or reverse the apparent correlation between smoking and the disease. The paradox of reversed correlation. One of the most surprising outcomes of Bergson's paradox is the possibility of a reversed correlation in the conditioned sample. In the general population, you might find a positive correlation between two variables, like smoking and lung disease. But after conditioning on a third variable, like lung disease, you might find that the correlation between smoking and lung disease is reversed. It becomes negative or disappears entirely. This reversed correlation happens because the sample of patients with lung disease does not represent the general population. The disease itself introduces new variables that alter the original relationship. In this scenario, the paradox shows that correlations between two variables can be distorted or even reversed when conditioning on a third variable that is a common cause for both variables. The implications for causality and inference. Bergson's paradox raises important questions about causality and statistical inference. When interpreting correlations in data, it is crucial to recognize that these correlations may be influenced by selection bias, especially when you condition on a variable that is related to both the independent and dependent variables. The paradox highlights the importance of careful sampling and understanding causal relationships before drawing conclusions. In medicine, for example, Bergson's paradox reminds us that clinical studies can be misleading if they are based on patients who already have the disease. The general population may have different risk factors than those who are already diagnosed, leading to distorted relationships between risk factors and diseases. In social science research, Bergson's paradox also highlights the importance of considering biases in sample selection. When studying the relationship between two variables, it's important to account for confounding factors and selection biases that could distort the apparent relationship between the variables. Resolving the paradox, random sampling and causal modeling. To resolve Bergson's paradox, it's essential to randomly sample from the population to avoid selection bias. Random sampling ensures that the sample is representative of the broader population and prevents artificial distortions in the observed relationship between variables. In practice, resolving Bergson's paradox often involves the use of statistical techniques like regression analysis and causal modeling. These methods can help adjust for confounding variables and account for selection bias, providing a more accurate understanding of the relationships between variables. Additionally, causal inference techniques such as randomized controlled trials, RCTs, are important tools in resolving Bergson's paradox. By randomly assigning participants to different groups, researchers can isolate the effect of a specific variable and eliminate biases introduced by conditioning on a third variable.